Before we dive into this sleepless stroll through the mysteries of modern life, do the honorable thing any responsible insomniac philosopher would do. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me, have you ever stared at a streetlight at 3 a.m. and thought, same energy? Come on, don't lurk in the shadows. Join the Night Watch. Your comment might just save a lonely street lamp from an existential crisis. They said the street slept when the sun went down, but that was a lie. In the medieval city, nightfall wasn't rest. It was release. As the last ember of daylight vanished behind the crooked rooftops, the city exhaled its secrets. The smell of rot, the whisper of rats, the uneven rhythm of boots and puddles, all of it came alive when decent people barred their doors. And somewhere among those flickering torches and trembling shutters, one man remained outside, the night watchman. He wasn't a hero, though sometimes he liked to imagine he was. Heroes wore armor and rode horses. He wore a torn cloak that smelled like wet dog and carried a wooden club he swore was more splinter than weapon. The darkness wasn't just a backdrop, it was a creature. It clung to walls, slithered between barrels, and whispered your name just to see if you'd turn around. Most people feared it. He had to live with it. Every shadow became a question, every rustle a possible thief. He'd walk down narrow alleys where the air was thick with smoke and secrets calling out, "All's well," when nothing ever was. That phrase wasn't reassurance, it was a prayer. A man who said it often enough could almost convince himself that the night was listening, that it might spare him out of pity. Sometimes he'd stop beneath a crooked lantern and watch the flame fight for its life against the wind. That small, trembling light. That was him. Always burning, never winning. People imagine the city at night as quiet, peaceful even, but that was just ignorance dressed as optimism. The city was a beast that never slept. The baker's ovens hissed in the distance. Thieves whispered in the dark, and the sound of a single cough could mean plague or poverty or both. Somewhere, a cat screamed. Somewhere else, someone didn't wake up. He told himself he was keeping order, but sometimes it felt like he was guarding chaos itself. There were moments, walking through those damp cobblestones, when he almost laughed. What a profession, really, to be the only fool awake while the rest of the world hid from its own nightmares. He'd think about quitting, of course, but then remember that quitting was for men with choices. He had debts, a sick mother, and a landlord with fewer teeth than mercy, so he stayed. Every night, he pulled that heavy cloak over his shoulders, picked up the club, and stepped into a darkness that didn't care whether he came back. He learned early that bravery wasn't about not being afraid. It was about pretending long enough that others thought you weren't. One night, a drunk stumbled out of a tavern waving a knife made from a broken bottle, swearing vengeance on a baker for stealing his wife's bread. The watchman broke up the fight, not because he cared, but because if someone died, he'd have to fill out a report. And reports meant ink, and ink cost money. The absurdity of it all made him grin sometimes. People imagined heroics. He dealt in logistics. Still, there was a kind of poetry in the absurd. He'd walk past lovers whispering promises in the dark and wonder how many of those would still matter by sunrise. He'd see nobles sneaking into houses that weren't theirs and wonder if sin smelled the same, no matter the size of your coin purse. He noticed everything, because he had to. A good night watchman didn't just guard the streets, he read them like a living manuscript of human foolishness, and sometimes the streets read him back. Once he thought he saw a shadow move on its own. Not a man, not an animal, something else. His heart stopped, his club trembled, and he almost ran. Then he realized it was his own reflection in a puddle. He laughed so hard he nearly fell over. "You're losing it," he muttered to himself, talking to water now. But deep down he knew the line between sanity and survival was as thin as the blade he didn't carry. The truth no one said aloud was that being a night guard was a slow form of dying. Not the noble kind, not the one sung by minstrels. It was erosion. Every night chipped away a little more of you. Your warmth, your patience, your belief that the world was ever kind. You started talking to walls, to cats, even to the moon, because at least they didn't talk back with judgment. The moon was his favorite companion, cold, silent, and always watching. Maybe that's why he trusted it. Sometimes, when the air turned colder than breath and the stars blinked like eyes half asleep, he wondered if he was the last real human left awake in the city. The thought terrified and comforted him all at once. To be alone was a curse, but to be the only one standing guard, that almost felt like purpose. Almost. He remembered a story his father once told, that the night belonged to spirits, and those who walked through it borrowed their time. Maybe that's why he never truly slept right again. Every dawn felt like being given back a life he hadn't earned. And yet, as he stood at the gate, watching the first lights spill across the rooftops, he felt something like victory. Not joy, not pride. Just the quiet satisfaction of still being alive when the darkness had tried so hard to claim him. He tightened his grip on the club, pulled his cloak tighter, and turned toward the alley once more. Somewhere out there, another night waited. And he would answer its call, because the city needed someone foolish enough to believe it could be tamed, or at least delayed until dawn. He often wondered what kind of man volunteered to wander the city at its most dangerous hour. Maybe the kind who'd already made peace with disappointment. Or maybe the kind who didn't fit anywhere else. The night didn't judge him, at least. It didn't care that his boots were falling apart or that his last meal had been a crust of bread dipped in rainwater. It didn't care that the city saw him as a nuisance rather than a protector. To them, he was little more than a moving shadow that interrupted their dreams with the clang of a staff against cobblestone. But that was the strange comfort of it. Anonymity. In a world obsessed with titles, he was simply the Watch. Every corner of the city had its own personality after sunset. The market square, lively and loud during the day, turned into a graveyard of forgotten fruits and stray dogs fighting over cabbage leaves. The butcher's alley smelled like iron and despair. Near the cathedral, beggars huddled under the saint's gaze, shivering and whispering prayers that smelled of cheap wine. Sometimes he'd pass them and nod as if to say, "Don't worry, misery's on patrol tonight." They'd look at him with hollow eyes that seemed to ask whether he'd truly seen what hid behind the dark. He wished he could tell them he hadn't. The taverns were his least favorite stops, not because of the danger, but because of the noise. Drunk men could find conflict in silence. They fought over dice, over women, over who looked at whose beard for too long. Once, two of them argued for an hour about whether goats could see ghosts. The watchman let them, partly because it was the most entertaining conversation he'd heard all week. But when the mugs started flying, he stepped in, only to end up covered in ale and regret. He broke it up eventually, earning a loaf of bread as thanks and a cracked rib as a souvenir. He liked to say he was paid in experiences. Unfortunately, the baker didn't accept those. Sometimes, in the midst of chaos, he caught glimpses of something tender. A woman opening her window just long enough to pour a bit of soup into a bowl for a stray cat. A child sneaking out to look at the stars because it was the only time they could dream without interruption. Those small acts reminded him that even in filth and fear, humanity still flickered. It was fragile, ridiculous, and endlessly beautiful, like a candle trying to outshine the moon. Then there were nights when the danger felt almost alive. He could sense it before it happened. A stillness too complete, a silence too heavy. His instincts, sharpened by repetition and exhaustion, told him to grip his club tighter. Once, near the old bridge, he heard footsteps that didn't match his own. He turned. Nothing. Turned again, and the sound stopped. He waited. Then a hand emerged from the dark, trembling, thin, clutching a dagger. The thief couldn't have been older than 16. The watchman sighed, not from fear, but fatigue. "Go home," he said, voice low. The boy ran. He didn't chase. Some fights weren't worth winning. He liked to think mercy made him noble, though he suspected it just made him lazy. Still, it was easier to forgive a thief than a noble. Nobles robbed you with paperwork and taxes. At least thieves looked you in the eye. Once, a baron told him, "You're the backbone of our city." He almost laughed out loud. If that was true, the city had scoliosis. There were nights colder than loneliness itself. His breath turned to smoke, and the metal of his belt felt like ice against his skin. He'd stamp his boots, rub his hands together, whisper curses at the wind as if it might take pity. He thought often about the absurdity of freezing to death while guarding people who slept beneath fur blankets. "If I die of cold," he muttered once, "I hope they at least give me a warm funeral." The wind didn't answer, but it felt like it laughed. The church bells marked the passing hours, each one heavier than the last. Between them stretched an eternity. Time moved differently in the dark, slower, quieter, crueler. He sometimes measured it by the number of cats he saw, or the times he resisted the urge to fall asleep standing up. Once, he leaned on his staff and woke up 15 minutes later to find a drunk man sleeping on his shoulder. Neither spoke. It was oddly comforting. Disease was the silent killer of his trade. The rats didn't care about schedules or patrols, and they moved like armies through the sewers, carrying death in their fur. He'd seen friends cough themselves into graves within a week, but even in that, there was dark humor. "If the plague doesn't get me," he'd say, "the smell will." He washed his hands in the fountain when he could, though the water was probably worse than the sickness. Still, the scariest part of the job wasn't the danger. It was the silence afterward. When he returned home, the city seemed to vanish behind him. The door creaked open, the room smelled of smoke and cabbage, and his wife pretended not to worry. She'd ask, "Quiet night?" And he'd always answer, "As quiet as sin." That was their ritual. Then he'd sit by the fire, eat what was left of supper, and feel his bones remind him that courage had a price. Yet he couldn't help but feel something like pride. Maybe foolish, maybe misplaced, but pride nonetheless. He'd walked through every fear the city could conjure, and he was still standing. That was worth something. He didn't protect the city because it loved him. He did it because someone had to, because in a world where no one watched, monsters, human or otherwise, flourished. As dawn began to creep in, he'd see the sky blush faintly behind the rooftop. The first rooster crowed like it was declaring victory over the night. He smiled every time because it meant he'd won another battle, not against criminals, but against the temptation to give up. He walked home as the city awoke, children chasing chickens, merchants shouting prices, priests muttering blessings that didn't reach the streets. And amidst that chaos, he felt invisible again, fading into the background until the next sunset called him back. He liked it that way. After all, heroes needed daylight. But guardians? They belonged to the dark. There were nights when the darkness felt heavier, as if the city itself were holding its breath. He'd walk through the mist with his lantern trembling in his hand, the light cutting a narrow tunnel through the fog. It wasn't fear that slowed his steps, but something older, a kind of awareness that came from too many years watching people reveal their true selves when no one was supposed to be looking. The city had layers, like rotten wood. During the day, it pretended to be civilized. At night, it stopped pretending. That's when he learned that people were far more honest in the dark. They whispered confessions into the wind, thinking no one could hear. But he always did. He knew where the lovers met, which doors opened for thieves, and which windows belonged to priests who practiced everything except what they preached. Once, he caught a noble sneaking into a butcher's daughter's room. The man tried to bribe him with a coin, and he laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so pitifully small. The rich thought a single silver piece could buy silence. The truth was, silence came cheap for everyone. The guard didn't tell anyone, not because of loyalty, but because gossip was the only power he had. Power that grew every night, one secret at a time. It was strange, though. The more secrets he collected, the less he cared about them. Once you've seen enough hypocrisy, it stops being shocking. The baker cheated scales, the priest drank wine meant for the altar, the mayor hired thieves to rob his rivals. Sin wasn't scandal anymore. It was background noise. He began to realize that morality was a luxury reserved for those who could afford to look clean. The poor didn't have that option. They stole bread, lied to tax collectors, hid from soldiers, not because they were wicked, but because hunger made honesty impractical. Sometimes, when he stopped to rest by the old fountain, he'd see his reflection ripple in the water. The face that looked back was older than he remembered, not in years, but in weight. The eyes were tired, not from lack of sleep, but from too much seeing. He wondered if the city ever noticed him, this ghost that wandered between worlds. Maybe not. Maybe that was the point. The night wasn't about glory, it was about endurance. And endurance had a kind of beauty of its own. Quiet, unsung, persistent. He used to think that courage was loud, that it came with speeches and shining swords. Now he knew it was silent. It was the sound of boots dragging through mud when your legs screamed to stop. It was standing guard in a storm soaked to the bone because someone had to ring the bell if the fire started. Once, lightning struck a house at the edge of the district. The flames devoured it in minutes, and he was the first to arrive. He shouted until his throat bled, pulled a boy from the smoke, then sat on the ground coughing black dust while others called him a hero. He didn't feel like one. Heroes, he thought, didn't smell like burnt straw and fear. And yet there were moments when the job felt almost holy. When he walked past the cathedral at midnight and heard the choir's faint echo from the morning service, he felt something stirring inside. Not faith, exactly, but awe. The same awe he felt watching dawn unfold, or listening to the rain tapping on stone. Maybe God didn't live in churches. Maybe he walked with the watchmen, the beggars, the sleepless souls who kept the world from collapsing while everyone else dreamed of heaven. There was one winter that almost killed him. The cold was merciless, seeping into his bones until even his thoughts felt frozen. He wrapped his cloak tighter, but it did nothing. He started talking to himself just to hear a voice. That's when he met the stray dog that would follow him for years. He named it Smoke, because it appeared and vanished without a sound. The two of them patrolled the streets like a mismatched pair of philosophers, one barking at rats, the other muttering about life. Smoke listened better than most men. They shared everything, scraps of food, moments of silence, even fear. Once, when a group of drunks cornered him near the docks, the dog lunged at them with a ferocity that made them scatter. He laughed afterward, half from relief, half from disbelief. "Guess I finally have a partner," he said. Smoke wagged its tail, unimpressed. From that night on, the watchman talked to the dog as if it were a scholar. He told it his theories about human stupidity, about how people needed rules not because they were evil, but because they were bored. Without rules, he said, half the city would rob the other half just for entertainment. Humor was his armor. Without it, the darkness would have swallowed him whole. He joked about the absurdity of his life, that he was a man who spent every night protecting people who didn't even like him. Once, he tried to explain this irony to a priest. The priest said, "The Lord sees your service." The guard laughed and replied, "Then maybe the Lord can pay my rent." The priest didn't laugh, but he thought it was one of his best lines. As years passed, the city changed, but the nights stayed the same. There were new thieves, new diseases, new rumors, but fear never aged. It only adapted. He started to notice how different the silence felt depending on where he stood. Near the river, it was thick and mournful, like a lullaby for the drowned. Near the castle, it was sharp and cold, like metal scraping against pride. Every district had its own heartbeat, and by now he knew them all. The rhythm of danger was as familiar as breathing. But the worst nights weren't the loud ones. They were the ones where nothing happened. No shouts, no fights, no footsteps. Just an emptiness so deep it made his mind turn inward. That's when memories crawled out. The faces of those who didn't make it home, the laughter of friends now buried, the sound of his father's voice telling him to find honest work. He almost laughed at that. If honesty was a job, it would have gone extinct centuries ago. Still, in that strange solitude, he began to understand something profound. Maybe his purpose wasn't to fight darkness, but to witness it, to stand in the void so others didn't have to. Maybe that was the quiet meaning of it all. Not to win, but to endure. He looked at smoke, at the city sleeping behind its walls, and whispered, "All's well." For once, he almost believed it. He once thought that the night was his enemy, but over the years, he began to see it as something far more complicated. The darkness wasn't cruel, it was honest. It showed things daylight tried to hide. Or the desperation behind laughter, the fear beneath pride, the loneliness that everyone carried like a second skin. He learned to read silence like other men read books. And when the streets were quiet, it wasn't peace. It was a pause before confession. The city always confessed eventually, sometimes with a scream, sometimes with a whisper, and he was always there to listen. There was a pattern to human behavior after midnight. The same faces, the same mistakes, a drunk begging forgiveness from a wall he thought was his wife, a thief praying to the same God as the man he was about to rob, lovers meeting under windows while pretending that love could survive the sunrise. He saw it all and started keeping a sort of mental record. Not for duty, but for amusement. People are predictable, he'd mutter to Smoke. It's like a play that never ends, except the actors forget their lines, and I'm the only one sober enough to notice. The dog would yawn as if to say that even philosophy was dull at this hour, but there were moments that broke the routine, small interruptions that reminded him the night still had teeth, like the time he found a man hanging from the bridge, not by execution, but by guilt. The letter in his pocket blamed debts and dishonor. The guard cut him down, muttering curses, not at the dead man, but at the living who'd made his life unbearable. He dragged the body to the church steps, banged on the door, and shouted for the priest. No one answered. He left the corpse there, whispering, "Maybe God's awake now." That night changed something in him. He stopped believing that salvation came from above. It came, if at all, from those who stayed awake while others slept, from people too stubborn to surrender to despair. He looked at the city differently after that, not as a collection of sinners, but as a collection of survivors, flawed, foolish, and fragile, yet still clinging to life with a kind of divine stubbornness. Maybe that was holiness in disguise. Maybe grace didn't wear robes. Maybe it wore rags and smelled faintly of ale. Sometimes he'd wonder what people dreamed about while he patrolled. Did the baker dream of bread that never burned? Did the noble dream of battles he never fought? Did anyone dream of him, the faceless man who kept the monsters at bay? Probably not. Most would forget he existed by morning. But perhaps that was his gift to them, the luxury of forgetting. When people feel safe, they erase the names of those who made them so. That's how peace survives, through selective memory. He noticed, too, how the world seemed to reset with each dawn. The same men who spat on him at night would nod politely in daylight, pretending not to know who had stopped them from freezing or bleeding in an alley hours before. Hypocrisy became such a common fragrance that he stopped noticing its stench. Once, a merchant thanked him for returning a stolen purse, and then shorted him on a loaf of bread the next day. Virtue, he thought, is just good lighting. Still, not all encounters were bitter. One morning, as he handed a lost child back to her mother, the woman pressed a small silver charm into his palm. "For protection," she said. He almost laughed. Protection was supposed to be his job, but he kept it anyway. Years later, that same charm saved his life. During a brawl in the docks, a knife struck his chest, but caught on the small piece of metal beneath his tunic. He stared at it in disbelief. "Guess protection works both ways," he murmured. The next day, he gave the charm to Smoke. "You've earned it," he said. The dog sneezed on it. He took that as acceptance. With time, his humor grew sharper, almost defiant. He joked that the city was his mistress, demanding, unfaithful, but impossible to leave. And like any long relationship, it had its rituals. Every night he'd knock twice on the same lamppost, spit on the cobblestone before crossing the bridge, and mutter, "Don't die tonight." Superstition, maybe. But in a world where prayers often went unanswered, small rituals felt like negotiations with fate. The worst nights weren't those with violence or storm, but the ones filled with whispers. He could never tell where they came from. Maybe wind between rooftops, maybe his own imagination. Once he swore he heard his name echoing through the streets. He called back, half afraid, half curious. Silence answered. He laughed nervously and said to Smoke, "If the city's talking to me, at least it's finally acknowledging the relationship." But deep down he wondered if he was beginning to merge with it, becoming less of a man and more of a presence, another shadow among many. The body ages differently in darkness. The joints stiffen faster, the eyesight dulls, but the hearing sharpens until every drip of water feels like a confession. He started noticing patterns in sound, the distant rhythm of wagon wheels, the specific pitch of fear in footsteps, the sigh of windows closing too quickly. He could tell the difference between a lover's whisper and a thief's breath just by listening. His senses had turned him into something almost supernatural, though he still smelled too human for comfort. Every now and then, he'd catch himself staring at the sunrise, with a strange guilt, as if he'd betrayed the night by surviving it. The world would wake up, full of promise, and he'd limp home feeling like a man out of time. The daylight wasn't made for him anymore. His body existed in one world, but his soul lingered in another, the quiet space between fear and duty. He began to understand why most men avoided the night. It wasn't the danger, it was the reflection. The dark doesn't lie. It shows you exactly who you are when no one's watching, and that truth can be terrifying. He sometimes laughed thinking about it, how people feared monsters while living comfortably with their own cruelty. "The devil's job is easy," he said once to Smoke. "Humans handle most of the work." There was comfort in knowing he wasn't alone in his contradictions. Even the city itself seemed confused. Holy in the morning, sinful by night, and entirely human in between. Maybe that was the real beauty of it all. Not purity, not perfection, but persistence. The stubborn insistence to keep breathing, building, sinning, and hoping, all within the same heartbeat. And as the first light crept once again over the horizon, painting gold over grime, he smiled wearily. He'd survived another night. The city would wake, pretending it had always been safe, and he would vanish into the day, unnoticed, unsung, the invisible thread that kept it all from unraveling. But as he walked home with Smoke trotting beside him, he whispered to the empty streets, "We did well, didn't we?" The silence didn't answer, but the dawn did, with a light so soft it almost felt like gratitude. There came a point when he no longer remembered what his life had been before the night. The rhythm of darkness had become his heartbeat, and silence his oldest companion. Even his dreams, when they came, smelled of damp stones and smoke. He'd sometimes wake thinking he was still on patrol, his hand reaching for a lantern that wasn't there. The night had carved him into its own shape, smoothing away the parts that once belonged to the sun. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion, he felt a strange pride, like an old soldier still standing after a battle no one else remembered fighting. He began to notice how the city changed with age, and how it aged him in return. The wooden doors rotted, the cobblestones cracked, and new buildings rose like teeth in a crooked smile. But the darkness stayed faithful. It wrapped everything in the same familiar shroud, reminding him that time was just another thief. He would sometimes laugh at the irony, that the only constant thing in life was the thing everyone feared. The dark never betrayed him. People did that well enough on their own. The new guards were different. Younger, louder, more concerned with pay than purpose. They carried swords that gleamed, but hearts that didn't. He'd try to teach them the unspoken rules, how to read footsteps, how to tell a scream of fear from one of anger, how to walk softly enough that rats ignored you. Most didn't listen. They thought he was just an old fool clinging to ghosts. Maybe they were right. But then the first real trouble came, and they ran faster than the drunks they were chasing. He didn't blame them. Courage, he knew, wasn't something you found. It was something that found you when you had nowhere else to go. There was a night when the city felt on the edge of something. Not quite chaos, but the kind of silence that happens right before it. He could feel it in the air, heavy and restless, like the breath of a storm. The taverns were too quiet, the dogs too still. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. That's when he heard it. A scream sharp enough to slice the night open. He ran, his boots hammering against the stones, and found a woman kneeling beside a man on the ground. Blood pooled like ink beneath the lantern light. She said the killer wore a hood, but everyone wore hoods. That was the city's beauty and its curse. Anonymity was its most democratic privilege. He stayed with the woman until dawn, saying nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. The murderer would be gone by now, swallowed by the same shadows he himself had once trusted. He wondered if justice even existed, or if it was just daylight pretending to have morals. The woman wept, and he handed her a scrap of cloth, the same one he used to clean his hands after patrol. She took it like a relic. It struck him then how little separated grief from faith. Both needed something to hold on to, even if it was dirty and frayed. After that night, he began writing things down, not reports for the captain, but thoughts, memories, fragments. He filled small scraps of parchment with lines about the city, the moon, the absurdity of human nature. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe he just wanted proof that he had existed beyond the uniform. One line he returned to often was, "We guard what we cannot fix." That became his prayer, his apology, and his joke all at once. Sometimes, between patrols, he'd watch the stars reflected in puddles and think they looked trapped, like heaven's own prisoners. Maybe they, too, were guards of some greater order, standing vigil over chaos. He found comfort in that thought. It made him feel less small, less forgotten. Smoke would lie beside him, tail twitching, eyes glowing like tiny lanterns. Together they looked like two survivors of an ancient siege no one else remembered. He'd toss the dog a piece of bread and whisper, "We're the last fools left, old friend." As the years passed, the line between duty and habit blurred. He wasn't sure if he kept walking the streets because he cared or because he didn't know what else to do. The city didn't need him anymore. It had newer guards, better locks, thicker walls, but he couldn't stop. He once tried staying home, sitting by the fire while his wife hummed. Within an hour, he found himself pacing the floor, his hand twitching for the staff that wasn't there. When she asked what was wrong, he smiled and said, "I'm allergic to peace." She didn't laugh. He did, because it was easier than explaining that silence felt lonelier indoors. He began to sense that his end would come not with drama, but with routine. One more night like any other, one more patrol down the same old streets. He imagined it sometimes, collapsing by a wall, the lantern rolling from his hand, the flame flickering out. The city would wake, the sun would rise, and life would go on. Someone might notice the body, or not. Maybe they'd bury him in the pauper's field. Maybe they wouldn't bother. And strangely, that thought didn't sadden him. There was a certain dignity in fading into the same darkness he had served. But life, in its usual cruelty, had other plans. One night, a fire broke out near the market. The wind turned it into a monster, leaping from roof to roof. People screamed, chaos swallowed order, and the young guards froze. He didn't think, he simply moved. Decades of instinct carried him through the smoke. He shouted directions, herded people to safety, ignored the sparks biting his skin. When a beam collapsed, he dragged a child out from beneath it, coughing blood and ash. His lungs burned, his vision blurred, but he kept going until his legs betrayed him. When they found him hours later, he was sitting against a wall, eyes open, the faintest smile still lingering on his face. The fire had spared him, but time had not. He lived, barely, long enough to see the dawn. The captain called him a hero. The townsfolk brought flowers. He found it all amusing. "They finally noticed me," he whispered to Smoke, who sat faithfully by his side. It took them long enough. He closed his eyes, not out of pain, but because the light felt too bright after so many years of shadow. They buried him quietly, as he would have liked. No speeches, no songs. The city moved on, but every night the guards still ring the bell at midnight, a small tradition no one quite remembers the origin of. Some say it's to mark the passing hours. Others say it's to honor the man who kept the city breathing while it slept. And when the streets fall silent and the wind brushes the walls, just so, a few claim to hear faint footsteps, steady, familiar, patient. The rhythm of a man still walking his eternal beat, whispering to the dark in that same weary voice. All's well. He used to think the city ended when he died, that somehow his absence would leave a hollow space where his footsteps used to echo. But the truth revealed itself quietly, cruelly. The city didn't pause. It yawned, stretched, and went on breathing as though nothing had changed. The same bells rang, the same shutters creaked open, and the same drunks staggered home at sunrise. The city had never belonged to him. He had belonged to it. Years passed, and his name became a whisper told by the newer guards, half legend, half warning. They said he was the one who could walk through fog without making a sound, the one who could hear a lie before it was spoken. They said when he died, the darkness wept. The older ones just smiled because they knew darkness never wept. It only waited. There was a peculiar poetry to how people remembered him. They didn't talk about his exhaustion or his cracked hands or the endless hunger. They spoke about his calm, about how he'd stand in front of chaos like a man waiting for rain. Memory has a strange sense of humor that way. It edits pain into meaning. It turns endurance into legend. Maybe that's why the young guards admired him. He represented something rare, someone who kept going without expecting applause. And yet, the city never forgot its old rhythms. Each night, a bell still rang at midnight, a tradition no one could trace. The sound drifted over rooftops, through narrow alleys, into sleeping rooms. Some said it was just custom. Others believed it was him, still keeping time, still walking unseen among them. The idea comforted people, which was ironic, considering how little comfort he'd ever found in life. There were nights when a faint silhouette was seen by the river, a man with a lantern, followed by a dog. No one could ever catch up to him. They called him the Sleepless One. Children dared each other to whisper his name after dark, believing he'd protect them from nightmares. Funny, he thought, somewhere beyond the veil, how they loved him more as a ghost than they ever did as a man. And maybe that was fair. Death has a way of making people polite. When he was alive, they avoided him in the streets, muttered about his smell, his rags, his endless mumbling. Now they built stories out of him. He'd have found that amusing. "You only become respectable when you can't correct anyone," he might have said, half smiling. The city itself seemed to age differently after he was gone. The cobblestones were replaced, the taverns grew brighter, the old market square turned into a plaza. But at night, when the lights dimmed, the city still hummed the same melody, low, cautious, familiar. Every watchman who walked those streets eventually noticed it. The silence wasn't empty. It was listening. And one of the new guards, a boy barely old enough to shave, once swore he heard footsteps beside him when he patrolled alone. He said there was laughter too, soft and distant. The captain dismissed it as wind, but the boy knew better. He could feel it, a presence that wasn't haunting but protective, like the air itself was keeping score. From that night on, he carried an old charm under his tunic, the kind passed down from older guards. It had teeth marks from a dog long gone. The city grew richer, but not kinder. Gold flooded the streets, poverty hid beneath it. Churches multiplied, as did brothels. Progress, they called it, though it smelled an awful lot like the same despair in new clothes. The guards became bureaucrats with armor. Their reports were written on parchment instead of memory. They had whistles now, torches that burned longer, weapons that gleamed sharper. But they didn't have what he had, that sense of listening to the night until it spoke back. Machines could light the streets, but none could quiet the darkness. Sometimes, in the hour before dawn, when even the rats seemed asleep, the city would fall into that same deep stillness, the kind that felt like holding your breath before remembering how to live again. Those were the moments people claimed to hear him most clearly, the soft ring of a staff against stone, the faint whisper of "all's well." The phrase carried differently now, not reassurance, but continuity, as if to say, it goes on, you go on. And in that, maybe, was the closest thing to immortality he'd ever have. Not statues, not songs, just echoes, soft enough that only the quiet could hear. There's a kind of holiness in being forgotten properly. To live on, not in name, but in rhythm. He had become part of the city's breath, a note within its endless heartbeat. If he could have spoken now, he'd probably have made a joke of it. Something dry and human, like, well, at least they didn't make me a saint. Saints don't get nights off either. He would have laughed at the absurdity of it all. A life spent chasing shadows, and now he'd become one. There's a certain poetry and irony like that. Maybe that's why the universe loves it so much. And perhaps that's the secret of every watchman, living or dead. To keep walking, even when no one sees, even when no one remembers why. Because someone has to, because silence needs a witness. Because the night, for all its cruelty, deserves to be seen. So, when the last light fades and the streets fall quiet, when the world holds its breath and even the stars seem to lean closer, listen carefully. You might hear the shuffle of old boots and the soft, almost amused voice of a man who never stopped watching, never stopped caring, never stopped believing that keeping the dark at bay, even for one more hour, was enough. And somewhere, deep within that whisper, you'll hear the echo of a smile. All's well. There are stories that begin again even after they end, like echoes that refuse to fade. His story was one of them. Time had long since buried his name beneath new rulers, new walls, and new languages. But the night remembered. It remembered the rhythm of his footsteps, the pattern of his patrols, the way his lantern used to draw trembling halos on the walls. The city had changed, yes, the stones polished, the filth disguised, but beneath it all the same heartbeat pulsed through the dark. Every generation believed they'd conquered fear, and every generation discovered it still had keys to the same old doors. The guards who came after him didn't know what they were inheriting. They thought of the night as an inconvenience, something to manage with laws and curfews, not something alive that breathed and listened. They wore polished armor that gleamed under the torches, but that light only made their shadows longer. They patrolled with whistles instead of silence, and they believed noise meant safety. It didn't. Noise was just another way to avoid hearing what the dark was trying to say. He would have laughed at that. Humanity's greatest talent, he used to say, was drowning out its own conscience. It wasn't that the city had forgotten him entirely. It was that remembering had become decorative. There was a small plaque near the river now, eroded and half hidden by moss. It read, "To the unnamed, who kept our nights safe." People passed it every day without a glance. Children leaned their bicycles against it. Lovers carved initials above it. The irony was perfect. Even in death, he was still guarding them from noticing him. But the night, loyal as ever, still told his story in its own strange ways. On certain evenings when the fog rolled in thicker than soup, the air would fill with faint whispers. Boots scuffing, a lantern creaking, a dog's soft bark carried through the mist. The older citizens didn't talk about it much. They just nodded at each other with that quiet understanding that some debts were never really paid off. The new generation treated those tales like entertainment. They joked about him, turned him into a campfire ghost story. If you stay out past midnight, they'd say, the watchman will ask if you're all right, and then lecture you about punctuality. He would have enjoyed that version of himself. At least it meant he was still teaching discipline, even if only by accident. And yet, beneath the humor, something remained. The night watchman had become a symbol of persistence. The idea that someone, somewhere, was still keeping an eye out when the world went blind. A poet once wrote a verse about him, calling him the keeper of forgotten lights. It wasn't entirely accurate, but it was flattering. He never cared for poets when alive. Said they were just thieves with better vocabulary, but he would have smiled at that line. There's a strange kind of immortality in being ordinary. The blacksmiths who forged his staff, the women who mended his cloak, the boys who mocked him in the streets, all of them vanished too. And yet, in a way, they're all still here. Every guard who walks those same cobblestones carries a piece of their work, their breath, their worry. The city is a patchwork of ghosts, pretending to be progress. He used to think that was tragic. Now, he'd probably call it beautiful. Sometimes, the stories said, The lanterns would flicker all at once without wind, just for a second, as if something unseen had passed by and politely dimmed the light. The guards who noticed didn't talk about it much. Superstition wasn't good for morale. But a few of them, the quiet ones, the ones who walked slower, claimed they felt calmer afterward. They didn't know why, they just did. Maybe it was because the darkness felt supervised. The priests eventually tried to canonize him, called him Saint Vigilus, patron of sleepless souls. It didn't stick. The city didn't like saints who smelled like rain and ale. But even centuries later, when the bells rang at midnight, people would pause just for a heartbeat. Old habits die harder than legends. There's something comforting in thinking someone's still watching, even if it's just a story, especially if it's just a story. In a way, he'd become what he always chased, a shadow. Not the kind that hides, but the kind that protects. Every city has one, every soul too. The part of you that stays awake when everything else sleeps, that listens when the world grows quiet, that reminds you to look twice before locking the door. That's him now. Not a man, but a memory wearing the shape of duty. And maybe that's what all of us become, sooner or later. Echoes of the things we did repeatedly, the things we cared about enough to haunt. Some haunt their mistakes. He haunted his purpose. There's worse legacies to leave behind. It's funny, really. He spent a lifetime making sure others could sleep. Now the night itself refuses to rest without him. The moon bends a little brighter over his old patrol routes. The wind hums softly through the alleys, and the cobblestones seem to sigh with each step of a passing guard. It's as if the city still expects him to appear, just around the next corner, shaking his head, muttering something cynical but kind. And if you happen to walk those streets one night, alone, when the lamps sputter and the world feels thinner, you might catch it too. A sound barely there, like a memory you didn't know was yours. The steady rhythm of boots on stone, the quiet jingle of a charm against a belt, a low, familiar voice whispering the same words that once kept an entire city from... All's well. There's something quietly absurd about immortality. Not the kind poets write about, that glowing romantic version, but the kind that smells like wet stone in old stories, the kind that doesn't ask your permission. The city still whispered his name sometimes, though it didn't realize it was doing so. In the rhythm of footsteps echoing through empty streets, in the rustle of cloaks brushing against the night, he lived on, not as a person, but as a pattern. Patterns, after all, are humanity's real religion. We repeat until we become ritual, and ritual becomes memory disguised as meaning. The night itself had changed shape. Torches had given way to lamps to electricity, but light never stopped being afraid of the dark. The difference was only in voltage. The guards now wore badges instead of cloaks, and their weapons gleamed with precision, yet the same fear lingered beneath the metal. A man with a flashlight was no braver than a man with a lantern. Progress, he might have said, was just an elegant form of repetition. Humanity upgraded its tools, but rarely its soul. He might have found this amusing. How centuries of invention hadn't invented a cure for fear. Fear remained the one resource that never ran out. It powered entire economies, built religions, and sold locks, lamps, and prayers. Maybe that's why he'd always liked the night. It stripped away illusions. In darkness, people stopped pretending. They either trembled or adapted, sometimes both. The night was the truest judge, quiet, impartial, mercilessly honest. Every once in a while, the silence of the city still thickened, as if remembering. It happened most often in the oldest parts, where the walls leaned inward, where the cobblestones were uneven, where history forgot to clean itself. There, under a moon that had seen too much, time felt negotiable. A shadow might stretch too long, a whisper might sound too familiar. People who passed through swore they felt watched, though not in a threatening way. It was more like the city itself had decided to keep an eye on them. That's the thing about ghosts. The best ones don't haunt, they supervise. Some claimed that the echo of his staff could still be heard near the river, always 3 steps ahead, never catching up. Others said a stray dog still roamed the alleys at dawn, tail wagging at things no one could see. One night, a young officer followed the sound of those invisible footsteps. He walked for an hour, heart pounding, until the trail ended at the same crumbling fountain where the watchman once rested. On the edge of the basin lay an old charm, dull silver, teeth marks faintly visible. The officer picked it up, feeling ridiculous, and pocketed it anyway. He didn't know why, but after that his patrols were quieter. He walked slower, he listened more. The world outside the city moved faster now. Machines roared, screens glowed, and people forgot how to be still. But inside the ancient streets, time seemed to resist obedience. The old rhythm remained: work, hunger, sleep, fear, and hope. The night watched it all unfold, unbothered by progress. It had seen worse. Plagues, wars, revolutions, all came and went like waves trying to wash away stone. The stone always won. Sometimes, late at night, when the city's electricity failed, as it occasionally did, the streets returned to their original state, raw, black, and vast. People panicked, as if the universe had forgotten them, But if you stood still long enough, your eyes adjusted and you could see what he used to see. Outlines, movement, breath. The darkness wasn't empty, it was full, full of everything light couldn't handle. That realization unsettled some and enlightened others. It always had. He would have chuckled at how history repeated itself with such confidence. There were still thieves, still liars, still priests with expensive shoes. The names changed, the costumes improved, but the plot was the same. Humanity was a theater troupe, forever rehearsing the same play and insisting it was a premiere. And yet, for all its predictability, he loved it. Because hidden among the noise, there were moments, small, almost invisible, that made it all worth guarding. A mother hurrying home with bread. Two lovers whispering promises that would break by morning but still felt true in that instant. The simple miracle of a candle refusing to go out. Even eternity, he suspected, gets bored. Maybe that's why it keeps recycling faces, voices, and destinies. Perhaps he had walked these streets before. Long before being a watchman, long before being human. Maybe in another age he'd been a torchbearer in some other city, keeping other monsters at bay. Maybe he'd always been this, a witness, a custodian of chaos pretending to be order. It was a comforting thought, in a tragic sort of way. Like realizing you've been playing the same song your whole life, but at least you've memorized the chords. There's humor in the cosmic loop. Humans think they invented it, with their clocks and calendars, but the universe has been laughing at punctuality since the dawn of time. The stars, after all, keep spinning in the same ridiculous circles, burning themselves to death just to rise again. Maybe that's what he admired most about existence, its stubborn refusal to learn from itself. Failure, when repeated long enough, starts to look like faith. And maybe that's the lesson he'd leave behind if he could speak again. Not about duty or courage, but about endurance. About showing up even when it feels pointless. About walking the same streets, knowing they'll never thank you, never remember you, and doing it anyway. Because the act itself matters. Because someone has to remind the dark that it isn't in charge. So the story doesn't really end. It just keeps walking, lantern in hand, boots steady, humor intact. The night shifts, the faces change, but somewhere, always somewhere, there's a figure making sure the world keeps turning while everyone else sleeps. And if you listen closely enough, if you let silence stretch a little longer than comfort allows, you might hear it too. A faint voice carried by the wind, almost amused, almost tender, reminding you that vigilance never dies. All's well. There's a peculiar peace that only the night understands. That quiet hum that vibrates between what is living and what is remembering. The city, though modern now, still carries the bones of its past beneath the pavement. If you listen closely enough, really listen, not with your ears, but with that ancient part of your mind that existed before language, you can hear the heartbeat of centuries. It's faint, but steady, like someone still walking, still keeping time. New buildings rise where the old watchtower once stood, all glass and ambition, trying to convince the sky they belong there. But the wind knows better. It slips through the alleys, curls around corners, and whispers names no one has said in 100 years. Somewhere in that whisper is laughter, dry, amused, maybe even proud. Because no matter how many towers you build, the ground still owns you. The city might evolve, but its ghosts remain unionized. Every generation thinks it invented fear. They give it new names. Anxiety, burnout, existential dread, but it's all the same music played on different instruments. The medieval guard facing the shadows and the modern man staring at his glowing phone at 3 a.m. are brothers in sleeplessness. One waited for thieves, the other waits for notifications. Both are trying to outlast a silence that feels too honest. It's funny how progress changes the scenery, but not the script. Humanity keeps finding cleverer ways to stay awake. Sometimes, during those dead hours when even the machines seem to hold their breath, the city feels almost alive again. The hum of the streetlights blends with the faint buzz of insects, and for a moment it sounds like chanting, a kind of mechanical prayer. Maybe the city prays too, not for salvation, but for remembrance. After all, everything built by hands eventually forgets who built it. The stones don't keep names, they keep echoes. There's a story people tell about a janitor who worked in one of the new towers. He cleaned the same corridors every night, listening to the hum of machines, the soft sigh of automatic doors. One evening, the lights flickered, and in the reflection of a window, he saw someone walking beside him, a man with a lantern, a cloak, and a tired half-smile. The janitor blinked, and the figure was gone. But when he checked the cameras later, one frame showed two silhouettes. One human. One impossible. He didn't tell anyone. Some truths aren't meant for bureaucracy. The janitor started leaving a cup of coffee on the windowsill every night after that, for the one who never sleeps. And oddly enough, the cup was always empty by morning. Some said condensation, others said evaporation. He said nothing. Sometimes faith isn't about belief, it's about participation. Maybe the universe appreciates small gestures of courtesy. It's strange how humor and tragedy share the same hallway. The watchman's ghost, if he truly walked there, probably found all of this hilarious. The coffee, the cameras, the theories. He'd have said something like, "So now you trap the dark in boxes that glow, and still it wins." He always had a soft spot for irony. It was the one luxury the poor could afford endlessly. And speaking of irony, the city eventually named a street after him. It wasn't the main boulevard, or even a busy one, just a narrow road that led nowhere special. But at its corner stood an old-style lamppost, the kind that didn't belong in a world of neon and drones. People said when it rained, that lamp glowed brighter than all the others, as if someone were standing under it again, guarding nothing but habit. Tourists loved taking pictures there. They called it the Guardian's Corner. Couples kissed beneath it. Artists painted it. No one noticed the stray dog that sometimes appeared beside the post, always sitting in the same place, tail still, eyes fixed on something only it could see. A reporter once tried to follow it home. The dog led him through twisting alleys until he realized he'd walked in a perfect circle. When he looked back, the animal was gone. He swore later that he'd heard someone laugh behind him. Low, warm, familiar. Cities are funny that way. They develop memory like old people, forgetful, fragmented, but stubbornly sentimental. They hold onto certain gestures, certain corners, certain nights, and perhaps that's how eternity works. Not in grand monuments, but in small rituals that keep happening long after their purpose is forgotten. You can feel that same presence when you walk alone after midnight, when your footsteps seem too loud and the world feels freshly washed of meaning. You sense it, that unseen companionship, that awareness that something ancient is pacing just behind you, not menacing, just attentive. Maybe that's not fear at all. Maybe that's history remembering your shape. If he could speak now, perhaps he'd say something ridiculous and profound in equal measure like he always did. "You think I watched over you? Truth is, I was just trying to stay awake," because that was the secret. Vigilance was never about heroism. It was about restlessness, about refusing to let the world slip away unnoticed, and maybe that's what he left behind for everyone who still listens. The art of noticing. Noticing the way the light trembles before dawn, the way a city exhales when the street's empty, the way even silence has texture if you let it linger. The watchman taught the night how to pay attention, and in return the night taught him how to endure. So when you walk past that corner and the rain taps against the cobblestones like fingers on a drum, don't rush. Stand still. Look at the lamp. Listen to the hum beneath the silence. And if the world suddenly feels less lonely, don't question it. Just smile. Somewhere, in the oldest part of the air, a familiar voice is probably smiling back, amused as ever by humanity's refusal to sleep, whispering in that timeless rhythm that kept an empire breathing for centuries. All's well. There's an odd thing about legends. They never really die. They just start pretending to be something else. What once was whispered beside firelight now hides inside electric currents, encoded in the hum of streetlights and the glow of late-night screens. The old watchman would have found that funny. Centuries spent fighting the dark, only for humans to invent new ways to bring it indoors. They call it progress, but it's really just a more sophisticated form of insomnia. He would have chuckled, leaned on his staff, and said, "You built light so bright you can't see your own shadows anymore." And he'd be right. Shadows are necessary. They prove that light exists. He always understood that balance. Every night he patrolled was a conversation between danger and safety, between fear and the illusion of control. The modern world isn't much different. Instead of thieves, there are deadlines. Instead of plague, anxiety. Instead of isolation, connection so constant it becomes another kind of loneliness. The night may have changed its outfit, but its personality remains stubbornly the same. Imagine him now, wandering the sleepless cities of this new age. The streets would fascinate him. Rivers of light, machines that move faster than horses, voices echoing from invisible mouths. He'd stand in front of a glowing billboard and mutter, "So that's where all the torches went." He'd try to understand this new kind of watchman, the ones who patrol not with clubs and bells, but with cameras and data. Their lanterns don't burn oil, but electricity. Their eyes see through lenses, not fear. Yet the irony would make him smile. Despite all this brilliance, people still look over their shoulders at night. Some habits outlive reason. He'd probably find comfort in that. Fear, in its own way, is proof of memory. It means the soul hasn't forgotten the price of safety. The city of his time lived under the rule of darkness, but the people of this one live under the tyranny of noise. Silence has become suspicious. Stillness feels dangerous. He'd walk past cafes glowing at 2 a.m., people tapping at screens, and think, so this is what progress looks like. Exhaustion with better furniture. There's comedy in that, the kind of cosmic joke that only someone who spent a lifetime awake could appreciate. Every generation believes it's the last to understand something essential, and every generation is wrong. The world doesn't lose wisdom. It just buries it under convenience. The watchman used to say the city taught him everything. Patience, humility, and the art of listening. Listening was survival then. Now it's therapy. He'd find that interesting too. People pay strangers to do what the night used to offer for free. a quiet space to hear themselves. He might sit on a park bench watching people hurry through the glow of their phones and notice how no one looks at the sky anymore. That would bother him. He'd tap a passing man on the shoulder and ask, "Who's guarding you if you never look up?" The man wouldn't understand. He'd smile and let it go. Some lessons can't be explained, they can only be lived. But even he would admit that there's beauty here. Strange, shimmering beauty. The city's hum, though artificial, still carries that rhythm he knew so well. The same pulse that once echoed in cobblestone now hums in circuits. The world has always been noisy, only the instruments have changed. And maybe that's why he'd still walk its streets, invisible but amused, keeping pace with neon lights instead of torch flames. Every now and then, someone would sense him, the security guard who feels a chill while making rounds, the taxi driver who swears he saw a man in a cloak at the corner of an empty intersection, the woman walking her dog who hears footsteps that stop when she does. They'd brush it off, but later, when they were alone, they'd smile without knowing why. A sense of reassurance, irrational but warm. As if someone old and tired had just nodded at them from the dark, silently saying, "You're doing fine." If ghosts could laugh, his laughter would be soft, not haunting. A kind of tired amusement that understands the ridiculousness of being human. Because he knows now that the real trick of existence isn't survival. It's continuity. The city goes on because people keep pretending they can master what they fear. And in that pretending, they accidentally create beauty. Maybe that's what the universe has been doing all along, improvising meaning out of chaos. There's a poetic symmetry in how the old and the new overlap. The streets may have changed names, the lanterns may burn differently, but every generation still has its watchmen, the quiet ones who stay up while others sleep. The nurses, the drivers, the programmers, the janitors, the thinkers, all guarding their own little pieces of the night. They don't ring bells anymore, but they carry the same weary grace in their eyes. Maybe that's why the world still spins, because there are always a few who refuse to close theirs. He'd see that, and he'd be proud. Not of himself, but of the continuation. The pattern endured. Someone was still watching, still listening, still whispering to the silence that someone else might hear. That's all he ever wanted. Not remembrance, not reward, just the knowledge that vigilance didn't die with him. So the legend stretches further now, not bound by city walls or torches, but carried in data streams and late-night thoughts. Somewhere, in every sleepless hour, his story breathes again. A small, flickering truth that refuses to go out. And maybe that's why, when the streets are empty and the hum of the world softens, some people still pause, sensing something ancient in the air. They won't know why. They'll just feel watched in the gentlest way, as though the darkness itself has learned manners. And in that fleeting moment, when the noise quiets and the air grows still, you might swear you hear it. That same patient rhythm, that same calm voice carried across centuries, amused and eternal, reminding you that the world, in all its chaos, is still somehow intact. All's well. Time moves differently for the things that endure. It stretches, bends, folds in on itself until centuries start to sound like breaths, and history becomes something alive rather than remembered. The city, wrapped in its modern costume of steel and noise, still beats with the same pulse it always had, one that begins when the lights go out. Every night it exhales, shedding its illusions of progress, and for a brief, delicate moment it becomes honest again. That's when you can almost feel him, not as a ghost, but as a rhythm woven into the bones of the place. The wind still moves through the streets the way it did when he walked them, curling around corners like a curious animal. It carries the same sense: oil, metal, rain, a faint trace of longing. And somewhere within that swirl of air his essence lingers, not haunting, not warning, just observing. Watching has always been his way of loving the world. He used to joke that people never noticed what truly mattered because they were too busy looking for meaning in places where it never lived. "You'll find more truth in a puddle than in a sermon," he once said to a priest, earning himself an entire week of dirty looks and no bread rations. He'd probably laugh at how humans have become both the watchers and the watched. Everyone now carries a little lantern in their pocket, a glowing device that records, illuminates, and distracts. They spend their nights staring into it, believing they're escaping the dark, when in truth they've just brought it closer. He'd shake his head and say, "You've made the night portable." It's strange, but he might admire it too. That same relentless need to see, to know, to document. A guard's instinct, refined by technology. And yet, for all this light, people seem more lost than ever. Maybe because seeing everything leaves less room for understanding anything. Still, he would appreciate the irony of it all. Humanity built towers that scraped the sky but forgot how to look up. They mapped the stars, then stopped wondering about them. They cured diseases, but invented new ones for the mind. He'd probably say, "You've traded plagues for paperwork," and he wouldn't be entirely wrong. There's a certain comedy in how civilization keeps inventing softer cages, ones you can decorate, ones you can love. But for all his cynicism, he'd find beauty in the chaos too. In the way the city glows after rain, the way laughter still echoes between buildings the same way it did centuries ago. He'd notice the details no one else does, the reflection of a red sign trembling in a puddle, the way a tired bus driver hums to stay awake, the stray cat pausing to stare at its own shadow. These small, unimportant things, he would see them as proof that the night still remembers how to breathe. Because life, he always believed, hides best in the things people consider irrelevant. He'd find it curious that people now pay to experience darkness, blackout spas, meditation chambers, simulated silence, as if they'd realized too late that light was never meant to be constant. He'd call it poetic justice. The very thing people once feared most has become their therapy. He would laugh at that, a low, knowing laugh that carried both affection and irony. "You miss the dark," he'd whisper to no one, because it was the only thing that told you the truth. The truth, of course, is that the night was never the enemy. It was the mirror. It showed people who they were when no one else was looking. He'd seen drunks cry like children, thieves hesitate before sinning, lovers confess things they couldn't bear to say in daylight. He'd seen kings sneak out dressed as beggars, and beggars dream like kings. The dark didn't corrupt them. It revealed them. That's what terrified them most. Not evil, honesty. And perhaps that's still true today. If you walk through the old quarter on a windless night, you might notice something strange. The air grows heavier, but not in a frightening way. More like the city holding its breath. The hum of cars fades, the lights dim slightly, and for a fleeting moment, time folds. You feel it then. A presence that isn't quite gone. A warmth in the air, faint but real, like the ghost of purpose. It's not there to scare you. It's there to remind you that someone once cared enough to guard what others abandoned. The city owes more to its forgotten protectors than it realizes. Every piece of safety, every sense of belonging, was built on the quiet persistence of those who endured when no one thanked them. He was one of them, invisible by design, remembered by accident. That's the kind of immortality that matters. The kind that doesn't demand applause, but still echoes through everything it touched. And maybe that's why, even now, when the clock strikes 12 and the city hums itself to sleep, a few lights flicker without reason. The technicians blame circuits, the poets blame spirits. But perhaps it's something simpler. Perhaps it's just the night saying hello. The old watchman might still be there, leaning against the wind, his lantern now invisible, his gaze eternal, amused at how little and how much has changed. He'd still whisper the same thing, though, that small, stubborn phrase that has survived plagues, wars, revolutions, and electricity. It isn't a command or a comfort. It's a declaration, a ritual, a reminder that someone is still paying attention. A truth old as the night itself, echoing softly through every street that still remembers how to listen. All's well. Some nights, if you stay awake long enough, you start to hear the world breathing. It's not a sound you can record or explain. It's more like a pulse beneath everything. The same rhythm that has carried cities through centuries, the same whisper that once followed the footsteps of the old watchman. The air seems thicker in those hours, as if time itself hesitates, unsure whether to keep moving. People call it insomnia. He would have called it awareness. There is something deeply human about the urge to stay awake when everything else sleeps. It's as if the night invites confession, the kind of quiet honesty daylight can't handle. That was always his realm. Not punishment, not control, but witnessing. He never judged what he saw. He just cataloged it silently, one act of madness or mercy at a time. The city might have outgrown his patrols, but not his purpose. Every sleepless soul has inherited it, whether they realize it or not. Each glowing window at 3 a.m. is a modern torch, a vigil against the endless dark. If he could see it now, he'd probably smirk at the irony. Humans spent centuries trying to conquer the night, building walls, lighting fires, inventing electricity, only to discover they missed it. Now they pay to escape back into it through meditation apps and camping trips. He'd laugh softly and say, "You made darkness illegal just to miss its company." There's a truth hidden in that joke. The more people try to silence mystery, the louder it echoes back. He always believed the night was the world's most honest teacher. It stripped away distractions. It forced you to meet yourself without the noise. In the dark, even your thoughts sound louder. That's why some people can't stand it. It doesn't let them hide. But for those who can bear it, it becomes a mirror. He used to say, "The dark isn't cruel, it's just thorough." And centuries later, that still holds true. The night doesn't punish, it clarifies. Every generation rediscovers this in its own way. The monks called it contemplation. The poets called it melancholy, and now people call it burnout. It's the same ancient exhaustion, just wearing different shoes. He'd look at today's sleepless crowds and see the same fear he saw in the cobbled alleys long ago. The fear of stillness. "You people are terrified of standing still," he'd say, amused. "You'll scroll until sunrise before you let silence say something you don't want to hear." But for all his teasing, he'd admire their persistence. Humans have always built their meaning out of noise. Songs, prayers, whispers, footsteps. Even their chaos has rhythm. He'd watch a modern city from a rooftop and recognize the pattern immediately. the endless hum of motion, the blinking lights like fireflies that forgot how to rest. He'd find comfort in that because it means they're still fighting the same battle he fought. To make the night just a little less lonely, he used to find beauty in the absurdity of it all. The way people kept believing the same things in slightly improved packaging. Hope, love, fear. None of it ever evolved, it just got better marketing. He'd see someone lighting a cigarette under a flickering lamp and think, "You're no different from the monks who prayed under stars. You've just replaced religion with routine." But he'd smile, not out of mockery, but affection. The human heart, he'd say, is the most stubborn invention of all. Sometimes he'd wonder if maybe that was his purpose all along. Not to protect the city, but to understand it. He never saved it from darkness. He saved it from forgetting it was alive. That's what every watchman does, in one form or another. They don't fight the night. They accompany it, remind it that someone's listening. The city needs that. Not safety, but witness. The world, for all its technology and bravado, still craves the same thing. Someone to notice. And maybe that's why his story never really ended. It just changed form. The watchman isn't a man anymore. He's an idea that keeps walking. Every time someone stays late to finish something that matters, every time someone checks the locks before bed, every time a nurse leans over a patient's bed in the quiet hours, that's him, still keeping vigil. The tools have changed, the light has changed, but the heartbeat beneath it all hasn't. If you've ever walked home under a streetlight and felt strangely seen, that's the echo of him, the warmth of being watched over by something you can't quite name. The mind tries to explain it away. Memory, superstition, déjà vu, but maybe it's simpler. Maybe it's gratitude. The night, after all, never forgot who kept it company. He would have found that deeply funny, that after everything, he became less a ghost and more a feeling. So this is eternity, he'd joke. A full-time job with no schedule and no retirement. But behind the humor, there'd be pride. Because what greater victory could there be than becoming part of the rhythm itself? To turn duty into heartbeat, vigilance into legacy. And if you listen, really listen, you can hear him smiling through the wind, through the hum of machines, through the quiet sigh of a city that still hasn't learned how to sleep. The old message remains, untouched by time or language, a reassurance that someone, somewhere, still remembers how to keep watch. All's well. There's a moment in every night when even the stars seem to hesitate, as if the sky itself is unsure whether to keep going. That's the hour he loved most. Back when he walked the cobblestones, that sliver of time between exhaustion and dawn felt like a secret the world hadn't yet noticed. The city was neither asleep nor awake. It simply existed, stripped of its performance. And, in that fragile pause, everything felt true. Even now, centuries later, that hour still lingers, though few ever stay still long enough to feel it. Most people are too busy surviving to notice when eternity pauses to take a breath. He always found humor in that, how humans sprinted toward tomorrow while tripping over the present. If he could speak to them now, he'd probably say, "You've built clocks everywhere, but none of you have time." There's a strange poetry in how people turned time into something to own rather than something to share. He never owned a clock. He measured nights by how many times he caught himself thinking. That's a terrifyingly accurate system, far less precise, far more honest. He used to wonder what the night thought of him. Did it resent him for trespassing? Or did it find his persistence amusing? This fragile creature with a stick and a lantern, daring to claim guardianship over something as ancient as darkness? Maybe that's why it never hurt him. The night respected effort, not outcome. It was a quiet agreement. He would keep walking, and it would let him. Every now and then he imagined it smiling back at him, invisible but present, like an old friend who speaks only in silences. That same relationship still exists today. The difference is that no one realizes they're part of it. The night doesn't belong to ghosts or gods. It belongs to those who keep it company. The cab driver at 3 a.m., the baker starting the ovens before dawn, the insomniac scrolling through thoughts instead of dreams. All of them are the night's new watchmen. They don't know it, but they're part of the same lineage, connected by the same invisible rhythm. The tools have changed, the uniform's gone, but the duty remains the same. Stay awake, so the world doesn't fall apart. He'd laugh if he saw it. You built cities that never sleep just to prove you could, he'd say, and then complained about being tired. There's a delicious irony in that. Humanity fought the darkness so hard that it accidentally banished rest. Now the lights never go out, and people still feel lost. Maybe the problem was never the dark. Maybe it was the illusion that light could fix what's human. Still, he would have admired the chaos. He was never sentimental about change. To him, the world was a rotating stage. The actors changed, the play stayed the same. He used to say that the city was just a body, and people were its thoughts. Most of them nonsense, he'd add, with a grin. He saw every night as a mind full of whispers. Some kind, some cruel, all real. And the more he walked, the more he realized the city wasn't something to protect. It was something to understand. That's what modern people forget. Cities are alive. They breathe through their drains, dream through their windows, and age through their walls. They remember more than anyone realizes. If you stand still in the right spot, say, an old alley that smells faintly of rust and rain, you might catch a glimpse of it. Not with your eyes, but with that small primal awareness that still knows when something bigger than you is paying attention. That feeling of being watched isn't fear, it's recognition. The city always remembers its witnesses. He'd tell you not to run from that feeling. Fear is just respect wearing a different hat, he'd say. You should be more afraid of the things that don't scare you anymore. He was right about that. Familiarity kills wonder faster than fear ever could. The moment people stopped fearing the dark, they stopped listening to it. And the dark, offended but patient, learned to speak in subtler ways. It stopped shouting in thunder and started whispering through thoughts. That's why silence feels so loud when you're alone. It's the world reminding you it's still there. Sometimes, when he was alive, he'd talk to himself just to fill that silence. Not prayers, exactly, just conversations. He'd ask questions no one could answer. Why do dogs bark at the wind but not at injustice? Why does loneliness smell like rain? And why does bread taste better when you're sad? He liked wondering. Wonder kept him sane. That's what most people forget. Curiosity is a kind of faith. You don't have to understand something to walk beside it. You just have to keep walking. If he were still here, he'd probably have adapted beautifully. He'd trade his lantern for a coffee and his staff for a sarcastic comment section. He'd be the kind of person who stays up reading other people's insomnia at 4 a.m. and replying with, "You're not broken, just nocturnal." He'd see the same patterns in the digital city as he once saw in the physical one. Light, noise, desperation, beauty. Humanity never stopped wandering. It just moved indoors. And maybe that's why his story refuses to end, because it was never really about him at all. It was about the act of staying awake, of bearing witness when no one else can. Every night, somewhere in the world, someone unknowingly continues what he began. They might be driving a truck through fog, guarding a hospital hallway, or staring at a ceiling full of thoughts. But the role is the same. Keep watch. Listen. Endure. That's the secret he always knew. The meaning isn't something you find at the end of the road. It's something that follows you while you walk it. The watchman was never trying to conquer the night. He was trying to understand it. And in doing so, he became part of its language. That's why the world still hums his rhythm long after his name faded. And if you listen close enough, not to the city, not to the sky, but to that faint pulse beneath your own skin, you might realize you've been carrying it too. The same patience, the same humor, the same quiet defiance that whispers through time. The same voice that looks at everything broken and still manages to say, without irony or fear, the only phrase that ever really mattered. All's well. There's something peculiar about the way history hides in plain sight. It doesn't disappear. It just changes its disguise. The old stones that once felt his boots now lie beneath asphalt, yet they still remember the rhythm. Every vibration of an engine, every hurried step of a passerby, still carries an echo of those ancient patrols. Cities are terrible at letting go. They're like old souls pretending to be young. New facades, same heartbeat. He would have liked that. He always said the world was less about change and more about costume. If he could walk those streets now, he'd probably shake his head and laugh. The lanterns are gone, but the glow remains, colder, harsher, born not from fire, but from electricity. He'd squint at it and mutter, "So you finally caught the sun and put it in a cage." He'd notice how people hurry faster now, as though outrunning something invisible. Yet their faces look the same as they did centuries ago. Distracted, yearning, late for something unnamed. Progress, he'd realize, never fixed human restlessness. It just gave it Wi-Fi. He'd be fascinated by how humans invented light only to keep fearing what it revealed. The shadows never left. They just moved indoors. He'd probably walk past glass towers and notice how their reflections ripple at night, distorting the lights like ghosts trying to remember themselves. He used to believe that fear gave the night its shape, but now he'd understand it differently. Maybe the night wasn't about fear at all. Maybe it was about honesty, a place where people couldn't pretend to be anything but human. Every time he passed a crowd, he'd recognize that old energy, the hum of anxiety and purpose that cities have always sung. He'd smile at the absurdity of it. "You still mistake noise for meaning," he'd say, amused. There was a saying in his time, "Silence tells the truth faster than words." But silence has become a rare luxury now, priced higher than gold. Humanity invented endless noise to avoid hearing itself. He'd find that tragic and hilarious in equal measure. He would linger near a cafe window, watching people talk to glowing screens instead of each other, and feel something like affection. Not pity, just understanding. Loneliness had always been the city's favorite perfume. It smelled different now, of coffee and ambition instead of coal and rain, but the essence was the same. People still sought connection while hiding behind the very things that isolated them. He'd sip someone's forgotten cup of coffee and murmur, "The world keeps inventing better ways to miss each other." There's something timeless about repetition. The baker still rises before dawn, the lovers still whisper under streetlights, the desperate still pray to unseen forces for one more chance. He would see it all and realize that survival is the world's oldest habit. That's what the night taught him. Endurance disguised as routine, and perhaps that's why his story still lingers. The world changes its tools, but never its needs. People still crave the same things: safety, belonging, a reason to keep moving. Sometimes he'd stop near a construction site and listen to the machines, their clattering almost rhythmic like a metallic heartbeat. It would remind him of the sound his boots made on wet cobblestones, the rhythm of duty. There was a strange comfort in it. He'd probably whisper, "You've traded footsteps for engines, but at least something's still walking." That was the beauty of existence. Everything that vanished returned in disguise. If he could speak to the living, he wouldn't lecture them. He'd tell stories instead, the kind that make people laugh halfway through and feel something unexpected by the end. He'd tell them about the thief who once stole nothing but a candle, saying it was for the light, not the wax. Or about the night he mistook a priest's shadow for the devil's and apologized to both just in case. He'd tell them that humor is the only thing that survives time without rotting. It's how the soul keeps itself from going sour. He'd find it funny that humans now chase immortality through data, as if being remembered by algorithms is the same as being understood. The old watchman would roll his eyes. "You built machines to remember you because you're too busy to do it yourselves." Yet, beneath the sarcasm, there'd be tenderness. He'd see the same fragile hope that had always driven humanity, the desire to leave a trace, to prove they were here, that their nights mattered. And maybe that's what his existence was all along. Proof that ordinary lives carry extraordinary weight when lived fully. He was never a hero, never a saint, just a man who kept walking. And somehow that was enough. The lesson wasn't in what he protected, but in how he endured. That's what every generation forgets until it remembers again. Greatness isn't loud. It's patient. It's the steady rhythm of someone who refuses to disappear. In the end, he'd find peace, not in being remembered, but in being repeated. Every act of kindness done quietly, every small courage unnoticed. That's where he lives now. Not as a ghost, but as an instinct. He doesn't need a body anymore. The city itself became his vessel. Its lights his eyes, its streets his veins, its heartbeat his own. And when the night deepens, when the noise fades for just a breath, you can almost feel him there, leaning invisibly on a railing, smirking at the absurdity of existence, listening to the hum of eternity pretending to be progress. And somewhere in that gentle, unseen smile lies the same phrase that carried him through every storm, every age, every endless night, passed from his lips into the pulse of the world itself. All's well. There's a peculiar moment that happens just before dawn, when the city seems to forget itself, when every street, every window, every whisper holds its breath. That thin veil between night and morning is where he used to exist best, a man suspended between two worlds that never quite claimed him. Even now, centuries later, that moment still belongs to him. The world may have moved on, but the quiet hasn't. Quiet is loyal. It remembers what humans forget. He always said the night was honest, but the dawn was hopeful. And hope, he'd insist, was far more dangerous. Hope made people reckless. It made them believe that the next day would be different, that the world could somehow improve, simply because the sun decided to rise again. He used to laugh at that thought, not out of cruelty, but out of recognition. Hope, after all, is what kept him walking through the dark all those years. It was ridiculous, and that's exactly why it worked. The trick, he once joked, is to keep believing in things that don't make sense, that they last longer. If he were here now, standing under the fluorescent hum of a sleepless city, he'd recognize that same strange hope flickering behind the tired eyes of people scrolling their way through the night. He'd probably tease them. You replaced prayer with Wi-Fi and confession with notifications. But deep down, he'd understand. Humans never stop searching for meaning. They just rename it every few decades. And sometimes renaming something is the only way to keep it alive. He'd wander into an all-night diner and sit quietly by the window, studying the reflection of his face against the neon signs. He'd see in it not a ghost, but a continuation, proof that nothing truly ends. It only transforms. The waitress, half asleep and half bored, would pour him coffee without asking. "Have you been out long?" she'd ask, the way humans always ask strangers questions they don't really want answered. He'd smile faintly. "A while," he'd say. That's the thing about eternity. It makes small talk unbearable. He'd watch the people around him and find them fascinating. A cab driver eating soup between fares. A woman reading a paperback that's falling apart. A man staring at his phone as if waiting for God to text back. The beauty of it all would break his heart in that familiar, gentle way. The ordinary moments were always what saved the world, though no one ever noticed. He used to believe heroism came from grand gestures, but now he'd know better. Survival, he'd realize, is built from small kindnesses done by tired people who keep showing up anyway. Outside, the city would yawn awake. Traffic lights blinking to life, pigeons rehearsing chaos, delivery trucks performing their morning symphony. He'd sip his coffee and marvel at how mornings hadn't learned subtlety in all these years. "The day's as loud as ever," he'd mutter. still trying too hard to prove it's alive. But he'd also feel something like admiration, because every sunrise, no matter how mechanical, still managed to trick the world into starting over. He'd step back into the street just as the first light touched the windows. The air would smell different now, like bread and exhaust and possibility. He'd noticed the cleaners hosing down the sidewalks, washing away the residue of another night's chaos. It was comforting, this endless routine of cleansing and forgetting. He'd see it as proof that life doesn't move forward. It circles gracefully, pretending to be progress. That's what makes it bearable, versus the illusion of direction. He might pause on a bridge, watching the water catch the new light. The reflections would ripple like memories trying to stay coherent. The world, he'd whisper, is just light trying to understand itself. That would make him laugh, because it sounded profound, but meant almost nothing. And yet, in a strange way, it felt true. The universe loves irony. It uses nonsense to explain everything. As people rushed past him, commuters, joggers, cyclists, he'd feel invisible again, and it would comfort him. He was always more at home in the in-between, too awake for dreams, too haunted for daylight. And perhaps that's what the city needed now more than ever. Someone willing to see what others avoided, to find humor in despair, to notice the small, sacred absurdities that keep humanity interesting. He'd watch a man drop his coffee and swear at the sky, and he'd grin. There it is, he'd think, proof that God still has a sense of humor. The sun would rise higher, bleaching the mystery out of everything, and he'd feel himself fading with it. But it wouldn't feel like dying, more like exhaling. He'd realize that the night no longer needed him. It had learned to watch itself. The legacy wasn't the man who stayed awake, but the world that learned why. Somewhere, someone would look up from their chaos, take a deep breath, and notice how beautiful it all still was despite everything, and that would be enough. Before the day fully claimed the sky, he'd turn one last time toward the receding shadows, that familiar friend that had followed him through centuries of silence. He'd whisper something almost like gratitude, though not quite. Then he'd laugh softly to himself, the same tired, amused laugh that had carried him through every storm, every heartbreak, every absurd moment of existence. Because after everything, after fear, after loss, after time itself, the same truth still lingered in his chest, unshakable and absurdly comforting. All's well. There's something about endings that always pretend to be beginnings. They wear the same clothes, just cleaner. When the watchman first realized he had become part of the city's memory, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt amused. Humans had such an odd way of honoring the past. They buried it under shopping malls, then put plaques on the walls saying, "We remember." He knew they didn't. Not really, but he didn't mind. Forgetting, he decided, was the only way people could handle how much they repeated themselves. If he could walk those streets now, he'd see his world reborn in steel and neon. The old tavern replaced by a bar that sold espresso instead of ale. The market square turned into a plaza with benches no one sat on because everyone was too busy looking down at tiny, glowing rectangles. He'd probably smirk and say, "So that's where all the prayers went." Because that's what people do now. They pray to screens that actually answer back, just never with what they need to hear. He'd find humor in the city's obsession with movement. Everyone rushing somewhere, as if being still had become illegal. He'd lean against a glass wall, invisible among them, and watch the parade of purpose. All these people, he'd think, walking faster than their souls. And yet, he'd feel a strange affection for them. Their exhaustion reminded him of himself, the same stubborn refusal to stop, the same silent fear that stopping would make life notice their absence. Humanity, he decided long ago, is the only species that mistakes exhaustion for accomplishment. He'd visit a museum one evening and discover, to his surprise, an exhibit about urban history. Behind the glass, there'd be an old lantern, rusted, cracked, labeled artifact from the medieval night watch. A small paragraph would describe the life of those who once patrolled the city. Guardians of the night, it would say, tasked with keeping order in times of danger. He'd stare at it for a long time, wondering if it was his. "So that's what I've become," he'd whisper. A description. It would make him laugh softly, but not sadly, because in a way, it meant the story worked. It survived. Just simplified, polished, and slightly inaccurate. That was fine. Truth, he'd learned, ages poorly without a little editing. Outside the museum, he'd sit on a bench and watch the lights flicker across the river. The reflections looked like trembling memories, half trying to stay and half trying to go. He'd think about how cities never stop evolving, not because they crave progress, but because they fear silence. Stillness, he'd mutter, is civilization's greatest superstition. The moment things get quiet, people panic. Maybe that's why the world hums now. Not from life, but from fear of losing the illusion of it. He'd noticed that even in all the noise, people still search for meaning in small, unexplainable things. A song that makes them cry for no reason, a stranger's kindness, the smell of rain that feels like memory. That, he thought, was the thread connecting everything. The universe hides its truths in nonsense, and only those tired enough to stop pretending they understand it ever see it clearly. He used to call those moments holy mistakes. The kind of beauty that sneaks in while you're busy complaining about something else. The world today would make him laugh often. He'd find the idea of self-care hilarious. We used to call that surviving, he'd say. But secretly, he'd admire that people had learned to name their wounds instead of hiding them. Naming things always made them less frightening. He'd walk past a group of people meditating in a park and grin. "Trying to do my old job, are you?" he'd whisper. Because what is meditation if not a night watch of the soul? Keeping guard while the world sleeps, listening for the sounds that make you human. And yet, even in this new age of lights and logic, he'd sense that people were lonelier than ever. Not because they lacked company, but because they lacked witnesses. He knew that loneliness wasn't the absence of people. It was the absence of being seen. Back in his time, he'd watch over strangers who never knew his name, and somehow, that was enough. Maybe that was what the world still needed. Not saviors, not heroes, just quiet witnesses who noticed the living and said, even without words, "You're safe. I'm here." He'd pass a child staring at the night sky and pause. The stars, though fewer now, still shimmered with the same ancient indifference. The child would point at one and ask her mother what it was. "A satellite," she'd answer without looking up. He'd smile faintly. "No," he'd whisper. "It's the same old light pretending to be something new." Humans always renamed wonder to feel smarter about it, but the stars didn't mind. They were too busy outliving names. He'd keep walking until he reached the oldest part of the city, the narrow streets that somehow resisted progress, where the air still carried the weight of stories. The lamps here flickered differently, almost as if they remembered him. For a moment, he'd feel the same peace he once knew, that sense of quiet duty that asked for nothing in return. He'd take a deep breath and realize how absurdly beautiful it was that, after all this time, the night still needed guardians. Just quieter ones, hidden in modern skin. If he could leave one message to those who carried that torch now, it wouldn't be a command or a warning. "It would be a joke," whispered gently through time. "You're not here to win. You're here to keep the lights on while the universe figures itself out." Because in the end, that's what his whole life had been. Not a battle, but a conversation. Between darkness and light, noise and silence, despair and laughter. And as dawn crawled over the horizon once more, painting the city in colors it didn't deserve, he'd feel that old ache in his chest. The familiar one that came every time he realized the world would outlast him yet again. He'd smile, not bitterly, but knowingly, because some truths don't need to be rewritten. They just need to be retold, over and over until someone hears them properly. And somewhere, hidden in the hum of traffic and the whisper of wind against glass, that same phrase would find its way back into the morning air. A phrase older than language, older than the city itself, carrying the faint humor and weary tenderness of a man who once kept the world from falling asleep too deeply. All's well. He used to think the city would one day grow too large for him to recognize, that progress would eventually bury memory under glass and noise. But standing here, centuries later, he'd realized that cities don't change. They just rearrange their disguises. The cobblestones may be gone, but the rhythm is the same. Every heartbeat, every hurried footstep, every sigh from a sleepless soul still pulses in the same unspoken language. The buildings are taller now, the air more electric, but the essence, the raw, nervous hum of humanity trying to outpace itself, that remains untouched. He'd walk along the boulevard and watch the neon lights flicker, and it would make him laugh. "You spent 1,000 years trying to make fire behave," he'd mumble, "and this is what you came up with." The glow was colder now, artificial but persistent, like a domesticated version of the flames that once terrified the world. He'd think about how humans never truly overcome their fears. They just rebrand them. Fire became electricity, superstition became science, gods became algorithms. And yet, they still whispered prayers, only now into microphones. If he stopped at a crosswalk, he'd notice something funny about modern faith. People don't look at the sky anymore, they look at signals. Red, yellow, green, tiny instructions from invisible systems telling them when to move, when to wait, when to pretend they're in control. It would remind him of church bells. Different sound, same obedience. He'd chuckle softly. "You replaced divine timing with traffic lights," he'd say. At least the bells had better music. Still, he'd admire their determination to organize chaos. The human race, he'd realize, has always been at war with uncertainty. They build calendars, schedules, passwords, little fences around the unknown. He once carried a lantern for comfort. Now they carry phones. Both give light, both offer connection, and both eventually die at the worst possible moment. Technology, he'd decide, was just a more sophisticated form of superstition. But he wouldn't mock it. He'd see beauty in the attempt, the act of trying. That's what made them worth watching. He'd pause near an office window and see a man inside, alone, staring at a spreadsheet as if it held the meaning of life. The man's eyes were tired, his tie loosened, his coffee cold. The watchman would smile gently. "You're not counting numbers," he'd think. "You're counting how much of yourself you've spent." It would remind him of the nights he used to patrol until dawn, exhausted but unable to stop, because stopping meant remembering why he started. Some labors never change, they just switch uniforms. The more he walked, the more he'd recognize his old self in the most unexpected places, in the security guards pacing lobbies, in the janitors sweeping floors long after everyone else has gone home, in the taxi drivers who greet the sunrise with bloodshot eyes. These were the new keepers of the night, the unseen pillars holding up civilization while the rest of the world slept. He'd nod at them invisibly, like a ghost saluting his descendants. If he could, he'd tell them that purpose doesn't always come wrapped in glory. Sometimes it looks like monotony. Sometimes it smells like coffee that's been reheated 3 times. He'd slip into a late-night train, surrounded by strangers who shared nothing but exhaustion. The car would hum with a kind of weary silence, the collective pause of lives in transit. He'd watch the faces, students, nurses, dreamers, and the perpetually lost, and feel something close to reverence. These were his people. Not the loud or the holy, but the ones who kept showing up. The ones who carried their weariness like a quiet badge of honor. He'd whisper, almost to himself, "You're all still walking the same beat, aren't you?" Every time the train passed through a tunnel, he'd see his reflection in the darkened glass, overlapping with the faces of the living. For a brief moment, he'd exist again, not as a ghost, but as a companion. The illusion would vanish as the lights returned, but he wouldn't mind. He was never meant to stay. He belonged to the in-between, to the moments when time loses its manners and everything feels possible. He'd probably find humor in the way people complain about insomnia. "You pay rent just to resent consciousness," he'd mutter. In his time, sleeplessness was a profession. Now it's a diagnosis. But he'd see through the irony. Insomnia, he'd think, is just the soul refusing to clock out. The night still has lessons to teach. It's not its fault people stop listening. He might wander into a bookstore, the kind that still smells like paper instead of profit, and browse the philosophy section. He'd run his finger along the spines of books that all tried, in their own clever ways, to answer the same question: what is the meaning of life? He'd smile at that. "You don't find meaning," he'd whisper. "You make it every night you don't give up." That was always the secret. The meaning wasn't written, it was walked. The dawn would start creeping up again, slow and golden, and he'd feel that familiar tug, the call of rest that never comes. He'd climb to the top of a building and watch the horizon catch fire. The light would pour over the rooftops like spilled gold, revealing everything the night had hidden. It was beautiful, but it always made him ache a little, because the daylight was too loud for reflection, too bright for wonder. People would wake soon, unaware that the darkness had just finished keeping its promise once more. He'd look out over the city, the skyline shimmering like a cathedral built by electricity, and realize that humanity had finally done it. They'd made the world their own kind of heaven, imperfect but luminous. He'd think, with a wry grin, "You've turned fear into furniture." And yet, he'd feel proud. Because despite everything, the noise, the chaos, the endless race against time, they were still here, still trying, still walking. Before fading with the light, he'd leave a whisper in the air, not for the world, but for the few who still listen. A reminder carved not in stone, but in the sound between heartbeats. The same quiet assurance that had guided him through centuries of silence and laughter and sorrow. All's well. He always believed the night had a sense of humor. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the quiet, patient kind that waits centuries to deliver its punchline. Maybe that's why it never truly let him go. The city, with all its shining chaos, had changed everything, except for the jokes. The same old absurdities still wandered its streets, dressed in newer clothes, holding more expensive distractions. Humanity was still the same brilliant paradox it had always been, terrified of the dark and yet doing everything possible to recreate it in their minds. He'd walk past a group of people waiting for a bus, faces glowing blue from their phones, and think, "You used to fear shadows, now you carry them in your pockets." It fascinated him, how humans managed to outsource anxiety to technology. Once they trembled at thunder, now they trembled at notifications. The old watchman would smirk, recognizing the same pulse, the same restless need to be seen, to be connected, to avoid silence at all costs. Silence was still the scariest sound in existence. It always had been. He'd sit in a cafe, invisible as always, and listen. Conversations were different now. Faster, lighter, full of words that meant less and revealed more. People discussed productivity as if it were salvation, trading sleep for status like monks of a digital monastery. He'd find it funny. You invented machines to make life easier, he'd think, and then made life harder just to keep them busy. But beneath the humor, there'd be admiration. The human capacity for irony was, to him, the purest form of intelligence. He'd notice how everyone seemed to be guarding something. Their image, their opinions, their fragile sense of control. It reminded him of his old job. Except back then, he guarded streets. Now they guarded illusions. The difference was subtle but important. People used to fear being attacked. Now they feared being ignored. The monsters had changed shape, but they were still hungry. He'd sip his coffee, which somehow tasted both burnt and expensive, and think that maybe progress was just evolution learning sarcasm. Everywhere he went, he'd find echoes of the same ancient questions dressed up in modern vocabulary. What does it mean to be safe? To be seen? To belong? He used to think these questions could be answered by duty, by order, by the rhythm of footsteps echoing through cobblestone alleys. Now he saw they could only be lived, never solved. Life wasn't a mystery to crack open, but a night to walk through. You didn't conquer darkness. You made peace with it. That was the real lesson. He'd pass a park where children were playing under lamplight, their laughter cutting through the hum of traffic. For a moment he'd stop and watch. The joy of it would sting a little, like a memory of warmth long forgotten. He'd realize that children understood what adults forgot. The night was not the enemy. It was an invitation to imagine, to explore, to wonder. Somewhere along the line, humanity traded wonder for Wi-Fi. He'd smile sadly at that thought. Curiosity used to build cities. Now it built algorithms. As he wandered deeper into the city's heart, he'd find himself drawn to the river again, the one that had once reflected lanterns and now shimmered with the reflections of endless advertisements. The surface looked like liquid electricity, restless and bright. He'd lean on the railing the same way he used to rest against the wooden posts of the old bridge and think about how water never really changes. It flows, it forgets, it forgives. Maybe that's what time was meant to do too. Humanity, though, had a harder time letting go. People built archives, memories, cloud storage, anything to trick themselves into believing forgetting was optional. But forgetting was sacred. It was how the world made room for new stories. He'd think about how the city now lived at double speed, how even emotions seemed fast-forwarded. People fell in love between notifications and grieved between meetings. They feared wasting time, but had no idea what to do with it when it was free. It reminded him of how villagers once complained about long nights. Too much darkness, they'd say, too much thinking. Now it was the opposite. Too much light, too little meaning. He'd laugh softly. So, that's progress, turning fear into distraction. He'd pass a street musician playing an old melody on a violin, something so haunting it seemed to pull ghosts out of the air. For a moment, the world would slow. The music would pour through him like memory, fragile but alive. It reminded him of what he'd always known, that beauty isn't found in perfection, but in persistence. The act of continuing, that's what starts. That's what made things sacred. Every note was a declaration of survival. And that, he thought, was humanity's real magic. The refusal to stay quiet, even when the world stopped listening. He'd move on, because he always did, drifting between moments like a rumor. Passing through crowds that didn't know he was there, he'd feel the pulse of life vibrating around him. Laughter, anger, dreams, despair, all of it tangled together, all of it messy and alive. He'd realize then that maybe the night had never belonged to him at all. It belonged to everyone who dared to stay awake long enough to feel it. And in that realization, he'd find peace. Not the dramatic kind found in stories, but the quiet kind that feels like an inside joke between you and the universe. He'd stand at the edge of a rooftop, watching the skyline flicker like a constellation of artificial stars and feel both ancient and new. The city had outgrown him, yet somehow he was still its pulse, because someone had to keep watching, even now, not to guard, not to protect, but simply to witness. The dawn would creep in again, slow and inevitable, and he'd know it was time to fade. But as he turned toward the receding night, that same mischievous smile would flicker across his face, the smile of a man who has seen everything and still finds it absurdly beautiful. The world would keep spinning, the lights would stay on, and humanity would keep pretending it understood itself. And, somewhere in the hum of the awakening city, in the laughter of strangers and the static between songs, his voice would linger one last time, the eternal echo of a guardian who never stopped believing that, despite everything, the world was still worth staying up for. All's well. He used to think eternity would be silent, but it turned out to have a soundtrack. The low, steady hum of humanity doing what it does best, moving, wanting, forgetting. The city no longer slept, and maybe that was its greatest flaw. He would walk its sleepless veins and listen to the rhythm that had replaced the old bell towers. Engines instead of echoes, screens instead of stars, notifications instead of whispers. And still, somehow, it felt familiar, because deep down, chaos has always had the same melody. It just keeps changing instruments. He'd stopped by a vending machine that glowed like a mechanical shrine, watching people feed it coins as if making small offerings to the god of convenience. You used to pray for bread, he'd think, now you pray for snacks. But there was tenderness in the observation. Humanity never really abandoned ritual, it just outsourced it. The same longing that once filled churches now filled online carts. The altar had gone digital, but the devotion was the same. Quiet, desperate, and oddly beautiful. Walking further, he'd find himself drawn to the edges of the city where light surrendered to shadow. That's where the real stories always lived. He'd pass a man sleeping under a bridge, wrapped in newspapers that spoke of futures he'd never see. He'd pause for a moment, remembering the countless nights he'd watched over those who had no roofs, no names, no guarantees. The faces changed, but the fragility didn't. Civilization had built towers taller than clouds, yet still hadn't figured out how to keep everyone warm. You conquered gravity, he'd mutter, but not greed. He'd stop near a wall covered in graffiti, splashes of color that screamed louder truths than any politician's speech. One phrase would stand out, "We are temporary, but so is pain." He'd run his hand across it, feeling the texture of defiance baked into the brick. In his time, rebellion had been whispered in taverns. Now it was spray-painted under bridges. Humanity hadn't stopped fighting the dark. It had just changed tactics. Hope, it seemed, always found a way to draw on walls. He'd wander into a late-night diner again, those strange sanctuaries of fluorescent light and endless coffee. A waitress would refill his cup without looking, her face carved by exhaustion and grace. She'd hum a tune under her breath, something older than either of them, and for a moment he'd forget the centuries between them. The world's accents, its languages, its costumes, they all changed, but the song of survival never did. He'd think about how laughter and resilience were humanity's two most underrated technologies. They kept the species from collapsing under its own genius. At a nearby booth, a young man would be talking to himself through a headset, lost in a game where digital avatars fought for imaginary kingdoms. The watchman would watch him for a while, fascinated. "So this is your new battlefield," he'd whisper, "and you still think you're winning?" He'd grin at the absurdity of it. The medieval wars he once patrolled were brutal, physical, and bloody, but at least people looked their enemies in the eye. Now they fought invisible wars against deadlines, data, and themselves. Different weapons, same exhaustion. Stepping back into the night, he'd notice the sky, polluted, pale but still somehow magnificent. The stars were faint now, hiding behind layers of ambition and progress, and yet he'd know they were still there. That was enough. The absence of light didn't mean the end of wonder, it just meant the world had forgotten how to look up. He'd laugh quietly, thinking how human eyes had traded constellations for screens. "You aimed for the heavens," he'd say, "and built Wi-Fi instead." It wasn't criticism, just observation. The kind that comes with affection and a touch of disbelief. He'd pass by a hospital, its windows glowing softly like lanterns of endurance. He'd pause to look through one, seeing a nurse checking on a patient with the same tenderness he once carried in his steps. It struck him how every age invents its own watchmen, people who stay awake so others can rest. Whether in armor or scrubs, the purpose was the same, to stand between chaos and safety, between life and loss. That realization would warm him in a way even eternity rarely did. He'd whisper a silent blessing, not religious, just deeply human, for all those who carried on his work without ever knowing it. Further down the street, a musician would be playing a saxophone near the subway entrance, his notes curling into the night like smoke. Few would stop to listen, but he would, because every melody is a form of remembering. The watchman would close his eyes and think, music is the only thing that ever truly forgives us. It was true then, it's true now. Sound had always been humanity's way of apologizing to itself for the mess it made. He'd think about how the city had become a reflection of its people. Loud, beautiful, flawed, and alive. It no longer needed guards to keep it safe. It needed witnesses to remind it that it was still worth saving. And that was his role now, not to interfere, not to protect, but to notice. To watch the way light bent through broken windows, the way strangers still offered directions, the way small acts of kindness stubbornly refused extinction. The night would begin to thin, that fragile moment when it almost forgets to be itself. He'd stand still, feeling the first trace of morning brushing against the horizon. The city would start to murmur again. Buses, alarms, yawns, ambition stretching its limbs. It was always the same transition, messy and magnificent. He'd smile because, despite everything, the world still kept its appointment with the sun. Humanity, for all its noise, still believed in beginnings. And as that belief shimmered through the waking air, he'd feel it, that familiar pulse, that ancient rhythm that had carried him across centuries. It was softer now, but still there, still beating beneath the hum of everything. He'd close his eyes, let the light touch his face, and whisper it once more, not as a duty, but as a truth he had finally learned to love. All's well. He always said that mornings were too confident. They burst in like someone flipping the lights on before you've had the chance to hide your emotions. The night, at least, had the decency to listen. The morning wanted to fix things. It arrived with promises it couldn't keep, sunlight pretending to be a solution. He used to laugh at that arrogance. And yet, standing at the edge of a waking city now, he had to admit it worked. People needed that illusion. Without it, no one would bother getting out of bed. Hope, he thought, was the world's most effective form of denial. He watched as the streets filled with movement again. Cars exhaled smoke, doors slammed, and the same faces began their daily performance, the ancient ritual of pretending they knew where they were going. It reminded him of the medieval merchants rushing to the market square, selling fish that smelled slightly too honest. Time had upgraded the costume, not the comedy. "You used to chase bread," he'd whisper. "Now you chase purpose. Both go stale just as fast." Yet there was tenderness in the observation. He knew that purpose, like bread, wasn't about longevity. It was about survival. He'd wander through a park where joggers moved in perfect rhythm, chasing health like knights chasing dragons. He admired the effort. In his day, people ran only if something was on fire, usually them. Now they ran for fun, or worse, for self-improvement. It was almost heroic, in a tragic sort of way. You invented comfort, he'd think, and then made suffering recreational. He'd watch a man check his smartwatch mid-run and smile knowingly. Technology had turned self-punishment into progress, and somehow everyone applauded. Sitting on a bench, he'd notice a group of teenagers laughing, the kind of laughter that doesn't ask permission. It echoed through the trees, reckless and alive. For a moment, he'd forget time. He'd realize that youth was the one thing the night could never steal from the world. Every generation believed it was the first to feel invincible, and that delusion was what kept humanity from collapsing. He'd grin softly, remembering how, even in his time, the apprentices would joke on patrol, convinced they'd live forever. Some things never expire. Not courage, not foolishness, not laughter. He'd see a couple arguing by the fountain, sharp words softened by morning light. He wouldn't hear the details, but he'd understand. People have been breaking each other's hearts in creative ways since language was invented. You don't need poetry, he'd think. You just need miscommunication. But then the woman would laugh, and the tension would dissolve. He'd feel a strange relief, as if the city itself exhaled. Love, he thought, wasn't a miracle. It was maintenance. And maybe that was better. Passing by an old bookstore, he'd stop at the window. Inside, dust floated through beams of light like slow-moving thoughts. Rows of words, thousands of lifetimes pressed between paper. He'd smile at the irony. Centuries ago, people feared forgetting. Now they feared running out of storage. You invented immortality, he'd whisper to the shelves, and then complained it took too long to read. Still, he admired the stubbornness of it, the human refusal to let thoughts die. Books, he decided, were just souls that refused to decompose. He'd walk through the marketplace, where everything shimmered with the illusion of abundance. People bought things not because they needed them, but because the emptiness in their chest demanded decoration. He'd watch a woman compare two identical handbags with the intensity of a philosopher debating the meaning of life. He'd chuckle, not unkindly. Desire, he'd think, is the only thing humans produce in surplus. And yet, he couldn't judge. He'd spent his own life walking the same streets night after night, searching for something unnamed. Maybe shopping was just modern wandering. At an intersection, he'd watch a man in a suit stand perfectly still, lost in his phone while the world rushed around him. For a moment, time froze, a single island of motionless thought amid a sea of noise. He'd realized that this, too, was a form of worship. The glowing screen, the bowed head, the silence. It was prayer disguised as connectivity. People still craved the sacred. They'd just outsourced it to convenience. The watchman would laugh softly. At least your gods are portable now, he'd murmur. He'd stop by a cafe again, drawn to the scent of roasted nostalgia. Inside, a barista scribbled hearts on coffee cups, and people stared into laptops as if mining meaning from pixels. He'd watch an elderly man sitting alone, stirring his drink slowly, eyes distant but content. That kind of stillness was rare now. The world moved so fast that anyone who paused looked like a philosopher by accident. He'd wish he could sit across from the man and say, "You're doing it right, you're still here." Because in a century obsessed with speed, existence itself had become a form of rebellion. As he left, the afternoon light would begin to stretch across the city, gilding the rooftops like memory. He'd notice how shadows lengthened quietly. No one ever paid attention to the way the day slipped into evening. That transition, he thought, was the most honest part of life. The way light fades without drama, without asking for applause. The night would soon return, not as an ending, but as a continuation. He'd feel it calling, the familiar pulse in the air, the promise of stories not yet finished. And maybe that was the point. Maybe his endless watching, his endless wandering, wasn't about guarding the world from danger, but reminding it that existence, absurd, messy, brilliant existence, was still happening. He'd laugh at the absurdity of it all, how humans spend their lives chasing meaning when meaning spends its time hiding in the smallest things. A laugh, a glance, a shared silence. That was the real light in the dark. Not grand gestures, just presence. As the sky began to dim and the lamps flickered on one by one, he'd feel the same old familiarity return, that sacred hum between what is fading and what is about to begin. And with it, a quiet truth would settle in him once more, that the world, for all its foolishness and beauty, was still turning, still breathing, still worth watching. And somewhere between the final sigh of daylight and the first whisper of night, his voice would rise again. Not as an echo, but as part of the rhythm itself. Calm, amused, eternal. All's well. He always said that time doesn't move forward. It simply learns new tricks. Watching the modern world confirmed it. Everything that once took patience now came in an instant. Food, news, affection, outrage. The city buzzed like a beehive that had lost its queen but decided to keep working anyway. He'd stroll through the noise, invisible, both amused and bewildered. You conquered distance, he'd think, but forgot how to arrive. The streets were faster now, but no one seemed to be going anywhere that mattered. He'd notice how people carried their worlds in their hands, glowing screens that could summon gods, lovers, or groceries with the same indifferent swipe. In his day, power like that would have been considered witchcraft. Back then, he'd chuckle, you burned people for less. Oh, he'd marvel at how humans invented miracles, then immediately got bored with them. That was the beautiful tragedy of progress. It kept fulfilling desires faster than people could invent new ones. Passing a digital billboard flashing 100 faces per second, he'd stop to watch. Every image promised happiness, beauty, success. The same ancient spells, just rendered in high definition. He'd shake his head. You replaced sermons with sales pitches, he'd say softly. But the gospel hasn't changed. The promise of perfection was older than fire. The only difference was that the modern gods came with subscription fees. He'd step into a subway car and notice the silence. Dozens of people, shoulder to shoulder, yet each floating in their own private dimension. It was a strange kind of solitude, collective, almost polite. No one spoke, but the air was heavy with unspoken noise. He'd think about how, in his time, silence belonged to the night. Now it had moved underground, hiding between tunnels and Wi-Fi signals. He'd smile, half sad, half impressed. Even loneliness, he realized, had evolved. Sitting down, he'd study the faces around him. The tired eyes, the clenched jaws, the subtle ballet of fidgeting thumbs. Every person seemed to be running a quiet emergency in their mind. Bills, heartbreak, deadlines, dreams too fragile to say out loud. He'd feel an odd kinship with them. The uniform had changed, but the exhaustion hadn't. People were still standing guard, still keeping watch, just over different battlegrounds. Their monsters were invisible now, but no less real. When the train emerged from the tunnel, sunlight slashed through the windows, and for a moment he saw something eternal, that flash of awe in people's faces when light reappeared. It reminded him of dawn breaking over cobblestone streets, of the way even the most hardened souls used to soften when the first glow touched the rooftops. The sun hadn't changed its entrance. Humanity had just stopped applauding. He'd grin and mutter, "Still showing up on time, old friend." Climbing back to the surface, he'd wander through a street fair. The smells, spices, sugar, smoke, hit him like déjà vu. Markets had always been the same theater. Voices bargaining, laughter spilling, music competing with chaos. He'd watch a street performer juggling knives and think, so, you still like flirting with danger, just better dressed. Humans, he realized, had an endless appetite for spectacle. They couldn't resist turning survival into entertainment. And maybe that was their greatest defense, to laugh at fear until it forgot what it was supposed to be. At one stall, a woman sold candles for mindfulness. He'd pick one up and read the label, Peaceful Energy, scented with renewal. He'd nearly burst out laughing. "We used to light these to keep demons away," he'd whisper, "and now you call it aromatherapy." The rebranding of the sacred fascinated him. Humans never stopped believing in magic. They just changed its packaging. Later, he'd rest near a fountain, watching the water twist and shimmer in the afternoon light. People tossed coins into it, eyes closed, lips moving silently. Wishes, the most ancient currency of all. He wondered what they asked for now. In his time, it was food, love, forgiveness. Now it was probably better Wi-Fi, longer weekends, fewer notifications. Yet he couldn't mock it. A wish, however small, was still an act of rebellion against despair. It meant people still believed the world could listen. As the day faded, he'd wander toward the outskirts of the city, where the buildings thinned and the air grew quieter. He'd pass a park where an old man was feeding pigeons, each movement slow and deliberate. The simplicity of it made him pause. There was a rhythm to that act, care disguised as habit. It was the same rhythm he'd once known, the same quiet insistence on staying present even when no one noticed. He'd feel that familiar ache in his chest, the kind that wasn't sadness, but something more complicated, something like gratitude. He'd think about how the night was no longer a frontier to be conquered, but a mirror to be ignored. People now feared boredom more than darkness. Yet boredom, he thought, was just another name for awareness. The moments when nothing happens are the only moments that tell the truth. That's when the mind reveals what it's really made of. Longing, memory, imagination. That's where the human spirit still hides, waiting for someone to remember it exists. He'd return to the city center as the lamps began to flicker on. The streets glowed with the same soft light that once guided his patrols, only colder now, a light too steady to feel alive. Still, it comforted him. The illumination, artificial or not, meant people were still afraid of the dark, and that fear kept the world turning. Fear wasn't the enemy, indifference was. The watchman would smile because he knew indifference was the only darkness light could never touch. Standing there between day and night, he'd sense the same pulse he'd felt for centuries, the heartbeat of a world forever trying to balance progress and peace. He'd think about how humans were both their own villains and saviors, doomed to repeat mistakes until they learned how to forgive themselves for making them. That was the real miracle of the night. Not that it ended, but that it always returned, patient and forgiving, ready to start over. As the wind picked up, carrying fragments of conversation, laughter, and the soft hum of distant music, he'd close his eyes and let it all wash through him. The city no longer needed his protection, but it still needed his witness. And maybe that was enough. To see, to understand, to keep remembering. That was his final duty. And as the first stars trembled awake above the skyline, that familiar phrase rose again, not from duty this time, but from love, the simple, ageless love of a man who'd walked through every version of humanity and still believed in it. All's well. He had always said that cities don't age, they molt. They shed their bricks, their habits, their fears, but the skeleton underneath remains the same. Now, centuries later, he could see the pattern clearer than ever. The city had traded torches for neon, prayers for Wi-Fi, silence for algorithms, yet its pulse, that stubborn rhythmic hum of existence, hadn't changed a bit. He'd laugh softly at the irony. You replaced cobblestones with concrete, he'd think, but you still trip in the same places. He wandered through the restless maze of lights and glass, watching reflections bounce off every surface like ghosts pretending to be modern. Everything gleamed, everything shimmered, yet somehow nothing seemed to glow. He remembered when light had texture, when a flame meant warmth and danger in equal measure. Now light had become flat, obedient. It stayed exactly where it was told, humming politely in LED strips. He would smirk, thinking how humanity had finally managed to domesticate even illumination, and in doing so had made it boring. You conquered darkness, he'd say, and then complained about insomnia. The night wind carried fragments of conversation. Laughter mixed with exhaustion, urgency tangled with small talk. People always spoke as if time were eavesdropping, as if rushing their words could make them matter more. He'd slow his steps just to listen. There was something endearing in their chaos, something profoundly human in the way they tried to turn noise into meaning. Every century invented new languages, yet none had ever improved on the art of misunderstanding. If confusion were a currency, he'd grin, you'd all be kings. A car horn cut through the air like a sermon. He turned toward a crowded intersection where red lights glowed like miniature sunsets. The people waiting to cross all stood perfectly aligned like soldiers awaiting divine permission. The moment the light changed, they surged forward, not running from danger, not toward salvation, just away from stillness. He found it fascinating. Humanity's oldest fear wasn't death or darkness, but the pause between movement and meaning. Passing a row of glass storefronts, he caught his reflection, faint, fractured, almost shy. It startled him, the way the modern world fragmented everything, even identity. Every window showed a slightly different version of himself, taller, older, distorted, transparent. He thought of how people now lived inside endless reflections. Social mirrors, digital echoes, curated illusions. You built a hall of mirrors, he whispered, and then got lost inside your own applause. Yet he couldn't help but admire the bravery of it. To live surrounded by your own image and still dare to search for your soul, that was courage. He drifted into a cafe where soft music floated like perfume and everyone sat glowing in the blue light of screens. Each table looked like an island, self-contained, self-absorbed, self-protecting. He'd watch as people took photos of their coffee before drinking it, as if proof mattered more than experience. You don't taste anymore, he'd muse. You document. But there was something beautiful in that, too. A desperate attempt to make the fleeting permanent. Maybe the impulse to capture life wasn't vanity. Maybe it was prayer in disguise. He ordered a coffee out of habit, though he could no longer feel warmth. When the cup arrived, he stared at the rising steam and thought of the nights when he'd stood guard outside taverns, smelling that same bitter promise from a distance. Coffee had become a metaphor for humanity itself. Strong, restless, occasionally burnt, but still capable of keeping the world awake. He'd grin at that thought. If civilization collapses, he'd say, it'll be from a caffeine shortage. Stepping back outside, he followed the hum of music toward a nearby plaza. A small crowd had gathered around a street musician, a woman with wild hair and a guitar that looked older than some nations. Her voice carried a kind of raw mercy, the kind that didn't ask to be recorded. He'd close his eyes and let it wash through him, that perfect fragile sound that only existed for those present. It reminded him that not everything sacred could be stored. Some beauty still had the decency to vanish after it was heard. He thought, the future has terrible manners. It never lets the moment finish speaking. As the song ended, coins clinked into her case and the crowd dissolved. He watched her smile, humble but defiant, as if she knew she was singing not to survive, but to prove she was still alive. That, he realized, was what humanity had always been doing, performing in the dark to remind itself it existed. Even now, surrounded by light, the same instinct burned. Survival had never been about power. It was about persistence with style. Further down the street, he passed a bookstore that stayed open late, its windows glowing like an invitation to the past. Inside, a man was shelving books with the reverence of a monk tending sacred texts. He'd paused to watch. There was something holy about that quiet work, about keeping stories alive in a world obsessed with updates. He'd smile, thinking that books were the only ghosts that refused to haunt. They waited politely until someone opened them. Outside again, he'd feel the temperature drop. The night was stretching its limbs, reclaiming what belonged to it. The city softened under its weight. Less frantic, more honest. That was the time he loved most, when everything slowed just enough for truth to sneak through. He'd pass a couple, walking hand in hand, their laughter spilling into the cool air. He'd remember a night long ago, a pair of lovers he'd once stopped for breaking curfew. He'd let them go. The heart, he'd told them, has its own patrol. He wondered if their descendants were still somewhere in this city, breaking rules for the same reason. He wandered until the streets emptied, until even the neon lights seemed a sigh. He thought about how the world had evolved to fear silence, how it filled every gap with noise, every pause with distraction. Yet, silence was the only language that ever told him the truth. It was where the world confessed. He'd lean against a lamppost and listen, truly listen, to the hum beneath everything, that soft, invisible heartbeat that no technology could replicate. And in that hum, he'd hear it again. Not words exactly, but meaning. The same message that had followed him through centuries, echoing in cobblestones and electricity alike. A truth so simple it almost felt like laughter. That even now, amid all the speed and chaos, amid the noise and the light, something ancient and steady still watched back. Something that didn't need to be seen to be real. He'd straighten, smile faintly, and whisper it into the wind. Not out of duty, but affection. The phrase that had once ended every night, now eternal, effortless, and true. All's well. He had once thought that immortality meant remembering everything, but now he understood it was the opposite. It meant learning how to forget without losing the lesson. The city had changed its language so many times that even silence sounded different. Yet, beneath all the noise, he could still hear that steady rhythm, the heartbeat of people pretending they weren't afraid. Fear had always been humanity's most faithful companion. It never left, it only changed costumes. In his time, it wore the face of the dark. Now, it wore the face of the future. He walked through the endless glow of the city's sleepless veins, where light spilled over metal and glass like liquid anxiety. It was beautiful in a strange way, a beauty that didn't ask permission. He'd watch a skyscraper shimmer against the night sky and think, you used to reach for heaven, now you just rent the view. But he admired it nonetheless. Every generation, he realized, built its towers from whatever material it had. Stone, steel, data, dreams. The structure changed, the hunger didn't. He passed a crowd gathered outside a glowing storefront. Inside, people were trying on new versions of themselves. Clothes, faces, attitudes. The city had become a masquerade that never ended. Everyone was performing, and everyone was exhausted. He could almost hear their thoughts humming beneath the music. Who do I need to be today to be loved? He smiled at the thought. We wore masks for plague, he mused. You wear them for approval. The irony wasn't cruel, it was tender. Humans, he thought, never stopped improvising ways to feel safe. Further along, a giant advertisement flickered above the street. A perfect face, smiling down, selling perfection as if it came in monthly installments. He stopped and looked up at it, amused. You've replaced saints with influencers, he muttered. At least the saints didn't use filters. But even as he mocked it, he understood. People weren't worshipping beauty. They were worshipping belonging. Everyone wanted to be seen, not for who they were, but for who they hoped to be. It was the same prayer he'd heard whispered centuries ago in different tongues. He found himself at the edge of a bridge, the city stretching behind him like a constellation made of mistakes that somehow turned out right. Below, the river reflected the lights in trembling streaks. Water never learned to hold still, and neither did people. That was comforting. He leaned on the railing, thinking of how life was really just one long attempt to stay upright in the current. Some people built boats, some learned to swim, and some, like him, just kept walking on the shore, pretending they had a map. A breeze carried the faint sound of music from somewhere, distant, ghostly, alive. Street performers, probably. He followed the melody until he found a small group playing instruments that looked halfway between relics and inventions. The notes drifted through the air, imperfect but sincere, and he realized that this was what progress couldn't replicate, the beauty of things slightly out of tune. In a world obsessed with perfection, flaws were rebellion. He smiled. Even music knows, he thought. Harmony is just chaos that learned manners. A young couple stopped nearby, listening, holding hands, but scrolling through their phones at the same time. It was a perfect metaphor, he thought. The eternal battle between presence and distraction. You've built miracles to escape boredom, he whispered, but you've forgotten how to be amazed. Still, he couldn't be too harsh. Humanity's greatest flaw was also its greatest virtue. It couldn't sit still. The same restlessness that invented the wheel had invented the algorithm. The same heart that once wrote prayers now wrote posts. The tools were different. The longing was the same. He moved toward an old library tucked between two modern towers, its stone facade stubbornly resisting the idea of progress. He stepped inside. The air was thick with quiet. the kind of silence that feels earned. Dust floated through thin beams of light, and the smell of old paper greeted him like an old friend. He ran his hand along the spines of the books, thinking about how every one of them was a time machine disguised as furniture. He picked one at random and smiled at its title. The past, he realized, was the only place where the present ever truly rested. Outside again, the wind had shifted, colder now, brushing his face like a reminder. He watched people rushing past, each carrying invisible burdens. Ambition, regret, hope disguised as exhaustion. He wondered if they ever stopped to notice how miraculous it was just to exist. In his time, survival had been an accomplishment. Now, survival was assumed, and happiness had become the prize. He found that funny, in a bittersweet way. You used to fear dying, he thought. Now you fear not living enough. He wandered into a quiet street where a small cafe still burned its lights long after closing. The owner sat alone, counting the register, humming softly. Through the window he saw the man pause, stretch, and smile at nothing in particular. That smile, tired, simple, unperformed, struck him like a memory. It was the kind of peace no progress could upgrade, the kind that came from finishing another day, no matter how small. He nodded to himself. That was what he had always been watching for. Not danger, not disaster, but moments like this, proof that the human spirit still remembered how to rest. He began walking again, slower this time, as if the city itself were breathing with him. The lamps flickered, the night deepened, and for a fleeting instant he could almost feel the world exhale. The noise softened, the pace relaxed. Even progress seemed to pause, just to listen. And in that fragile calm, he felt it again. The quiet pulse that had followed him across centuries, the heartbeat of something unbreakable. It wasn't the city's hum, or the wind's sigh, or the rhythm of footsteps against stone. It was the sound of continuity, of existence refusing to give up on itself. He closed his eyes and smiled, the same tired, amused smile he had carried through every age, through every light and every darkness. Because no matter how loud the world became, no matter how much it forgot, there was always that whisper underneath it all, the one that said it was still worth watching, still worth believing in. And with that, the old watchman, who was no longer guarding walls but memories, spoke again, softly but surely, his words carried through time like the faint echo of a bell that refuses to fade. All's well. He used to believe that the city never truly slept. Now he knew it simply dreamed with its eyes open. The hum of the streetlights, the distant sirens, the faint rhythm of footsteps echoing through concrete corridors, all of it formed a lullaby for a world too restless to rest. He walked through it quietly, like a memory that had learned to mind its own business. And yet, he couldn't help but smile at how much humanity still pretended to be awake. You've mastered motion, he thought, but not awareness. It was the oldest trick in existence, to mistake movement for meaning. He turned a corner and found himself in front of a row of old apartment buildings, their windows glowing like fragments of 1,000 different stories. Behind each one, someone was living a version of life they believed was unique, though the watchman knew better. The same arguments, the same tenderness, the same loneliness dressed in new furniture. He used to patrol narrow medieval streets where you could hear every sigh through thin wooden walls. Now, people lived stacked like books in a shelf, pretending privacy was freedom. You built towers to escape each other, he mused, and still end up writing about love. A cat darted across his path, sleek and silent, its eyes catching the lamplight. He followed it for a moment, amused at how little cats had changed. Even in his time, they were smug little philosophers, creatures who understood that power required neither strength nor effort, just timing. The cat slipped into an alley, tail flicking with royal indifference, and he laughed. The city worships ambition, he thought, but cats worship themselves. Guess who's happier? The alley opened into a street lined with bars, the kind where laughter tried too hard and music begged to be remembered. He paused outside one, listening. The people inside were celebrating something. Birthdays, endings, boredom, maybe all at once. It was comforting in a way. He'd seen the same ritual centuries ago around fire pits and flagons of ale. Different century, same cure for emptiness. The human race, he decided, was powered by hope and fermented grains. He would have raised a glass himself if ghosts could drink. He walked on until the laughter faded into the steady hum of the city again. A group of workers passed him, their uniforms stained with sweat and time. They looked tired but alive, their steps steady with the rhythm of survival. He'd always admired that, the quiet heroism of ordinary people who kept the world running while no one noticed. The night was never dangerous because of darkness, he thought. It was dangerous because people got tired. That was the truth no one wanted to admit. Civilization was built not on greatness, but on endurance. Further ahead, a man sat under a street lamp reading a newspaper. Though the hour was far too late for headlines to matter, the watchman peered over his shoulder. The words were about politics, scandal, the usual theater of human confusion. He chuckled softly. You still confused noise for news, he said to the night. It amused him how people could spend centuries evolving and still be surprised that power lied. In the end, truth was never hidden. It was just ignored because it didn't trend. He crossed a bridge and leaned against the railing, looking down at the slow, murky river crawling beneath him. The reflection of the city rippled across the surface, distorted and beautiful. He thought about how water never stopped moving, even when trapped between stone and steel. It reminded him of something essential, that survival wasn't about strength, but flexibility. The strongest thing I ever saw, he thought, was a stream that refused to stay still. He smiled, realizing that maybe people were the same. The world tried to contain them, label them, drown them in expectation, but somehow they kept flowing. He moved again, past a row of empty bus stops where advertisements glowed brighter than the stars. One read, "Be the best version of yourself." He sighed. "You've turned self-improvement into an industry," he whispered. "We just called it growing up." But he didn't mock it. Every age had its ways of coping with dissatisfaction. In his time, people sought salvation through confession. Now they sought it through self-help. Both promised transformation, both sold redemption, one in prayer, the other in paperback. A young man passed him, earbuds in, eyes glued to his phone, face lit by artificial glow. The watchman watched him for a moment, fascinated. There was something poetic about how humans had built devices that connected them to the world and disconnected them from themselves. You talk to everyone, he thought, except the person inside your own head. He wondered if loneliness had truly increased, or if people had just become more efficient at hiding it. The street narrowed, and he found himself in front of an old church, squeezed between modern buildings like an afterthought. The doors were locked, but the candlelight inside still flickered through the stained glass. He stared at it, thinking about how faith never really disappeared. It just changed its vocabulary. People still prayed. Only now they called it manifesting, affirming. Manifesting again when it didn't work the first time. He grinned. "You gave up confessing sins," he said, "but not confessing desires." The need for meaning was eternal. The methods were just marketing. He continued walking until he reached the edge of the city, where the lights began to thin and the stars dared to show themselves again. The silence felt heavier here, but it wasn't empty. It was honest. He inhaled deeply, feeling the cool air move through him like memory. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a siren wailed, and life carried on. It struck him then how the world was both fragile and unstoppable. Humans broke hearts, systems, promises, but somehow, never the pattern. He smiled as the wind shifted again, carrying with it the smell of rain and faraway smoke. It was familiar, a scent that belonged to every age he'd ever lived through. He realized that the world, for all its chaos and noise, had never actually changed at its core. It was still built on longing, laughter, foolishness, and fire. He found comfort in that continuity, in knowing that imperfection was the truest form of eternity. And as he turned back toward the glow of the city, he whispered it again, softly, almost playfully, as though the world might overhear and blush. "All's well. Gee," he used to think dawn was the city's apology, that soft, reluctant light trying to make up for everything the night had seen. It still worked that way, he decided, even after centuries. The horizon blushed as if embarrassed to be caught existing again. He walked slowly, hands behind his back, listening to the birds rehearse their morning arguments. There was something comforting about how loudly life returned every day, as if determined to prove it hadn't been defeated in the dark. "You've built skyscrapers," he murmured, "but the pigeons still run the place." A baker was already arranging pastries in the window, steam fogging up the glass in lazy curls. The smell of bread drifted into the street, warm, humble, eternal. He smiled. Bread had outlived empires, kings, gods, and diets. The real ruler of humanity, he thought, has always been yeast. He stood for a moment watching as a tired delivery man handed over crates of flour. That small ritual, ordinary, unnoticed, carried more grace than any cathedral. People still broke bread to say, "I'm here, you're here, let's keep going." That was enough. He wandered further, watching the early commuters emerge, each wrapped in their private battles. Some walked quickly, already late for a future that hadn't happened yet. Others moved slowly, stretching their last moments of peace. It was fascinating how the world measured worth by urgency. If rushing were a virtue, he thought, you'd all be saints. But he couldn't judge them. Even in his time, people hurried toward meaning as if it were a train they might miss. Maybe that was humanity's most endearing flaw, confusing velocity for purpose. A street cleaner pushed his broom across the pavement, sweeping away the evidence of last night. Cigarette butts, bottle caps, fragments of celebration and regret. He watched him for a while, admiring the quiet dignity in the act. The city's heartbeat depended not on mayors or millionaires, but on the invisible hands that kept it from collapsing into itself. The world, he thought, isn't saved by heroes, it's maintained by people who show up. He found that both funny and deeply moving, that the secret to civilization was, and always had been, showing up on time with a broom. Crossing into a park, he noticed joggers moving like clockwork, sweating, panting, listening to voices in their ears telling them to push harder, run faster. He smiled. Once upon a time, humans ran to survive. Now they did it to feel alive. Progress, he whispered, is learning to invent new reasons to suffer. Still, there was something admirable in it. This relentless drive to improve, even when no one was watching. Maybe self-torture was just evolution's favorite hobby. A child fed pigeons near the fountain, laughing as they fluttered around in greedy chaos. That sound, laughter unguarded, messy, genuine, struck him harder than he expected. For all the world's upgrades, nothing had improved on that particular frequency. It was proof that innocence still managed to sneak past the algorithms. He thought about how every generation claimed the next was doomed, yet somehow laughter always survived. Humanity, he thought, is like a stubborn plant that grows between stones. It doesn't know when to quit. He sat on a bench for a moment, watching the morning unfold. A man in a suit scrolled through emails, lips pressed into a line of quiet despair. Nearby, an elderly woman threw crumbs to the ducks with religious precision. Between them existed the full spectrum of human experience. Ambition and acceptance, noise and peace, beginning and ending. He grinned. If you want to understand the universe, he thought, just sit in a park long enough. It'll explain itself in ducks. The church bells began to ring, their sound weaving through the air like nostalgia, pretending to be music. People barely looked up. Once, that sound meant salvation. Now it meant traffic was about to get worse. He couldn't blame them. After centuries of promises, even faith needed rebranding. Yet, there was still something holy in how the bells kept ringing anyway. Unbothered, consistent, beautiful. Maybe, he thought, God outsourced persistence to bells. He started walking again, the city now fully awake, its chaos settling into routine, the hum of engines, the chatter of cafe lines, the faint impatience of horns. It was all perfectly synchronized, a living symphony of distraction. He realized the modern world had replaced mystery with management. Everything was scheduled, measured, optimized. But meaning, he thought, didn't like appointments. You can't spreadsheet your soul, he murmured. It refuses to be quantified. As he reached a busy crosswalk, the crowd surged forward when the light turned green. A man bumped into him, muttered an apology, and hurried away. That small exchange, so brief it barely existed, reminded him how fragile connection had become. The modern handshake was digital, the modern apology automated. Still, even that fleeting human moment carried weight. He smiled at the absurdity of it all. You built machines that can talk, he thought, but you still need eye contact to feel real. He wandered into a bookstore, one of the few survivors in the age of screens. The air was thick with dust and silence, the kind that demanded reverence. Rows of stories waited patiently, spines slightly bent like tired soldiers who refused retirement. He ran a finger along the shelf and felt an odd tenderness. Books were humanity's most sincere form of reincarnation, pieces of people who refuse to vanish. Every shelf, he thought, is a graveyard that hums. Yet somehow it didn't feel sad. It felt alive, as if the pages were whispering, "We're still here. Keep reading." When he stepped back into the sunlight, he noticed how everything shimmered slightly, like the city was trying to remember its own name. The wind carried 1,000 scents: coffee, exhaust, flowers, and ambition. It was intoxicating, chaotic, familiar. He felt something stir inside him, a quiet awe he thought he'd lost. For all its flaws and noise and restlessness, the world still had the decency to astonish him. He stopped at the corner watching people cross, watching life flow in every direction at once. Maybe that was the point of all his wandering. Not to guard, not to judge, but to witness the stubborn beauty of existence repeating itself, over and over, with new faces and the same heartbeat. And as the sunlight grew stronger, painting the city in gold, he smiled and whispered the words he had carried across centuries, not as duty, but as devotion. All's well. He liked to think of twilight as the city's confession, that brief, uncertain hour when the world hesitated between pretending to be alive and admitting it was tired. The skyline melted into soft tones of orange and ash, as if the light itself couldn't decide whether to stay or go. He walked through the quieting streets, feeling the shift. Daylight revealed, darkness remembered, and between them was that fragile pause where truth usually hid. You're all chasing sunsets, he thought, but no one sticks around to see what happens after. Shopkeepers were closing up, pulling metal shutters with weary grace. Neon lights flickered awake, blinking like uncertain eyes. The city was changing costumes again, trading productivity for pretense. He always found that funny. How humans thought they controlled time when they were merely reacting to it. They scheduled, planned, optimized. But time didn't care for appointments. It preferred irony. You make calendars, he mused, so you can pretend eternity needs organization. Passing a restaurant, he saw people dining under strings of warm light, their laughter weaving through the clinking of glasses. It was such a familiar melody, joy with an undertone of exhaustion. Everyone trying to squeeze meaning out of moments before the next notification. He smiled. You used to toast to survival, he thought. Now you toast to engagement metrics? Still, there was tenderness in it. People gathering, eating, sharing. That hadn't changed in 1,000 years. Civilization might have upgraded the cutlery, but the hunger was still the same. He wandered on, drawn to the glow of a street artist performing near a subway entrance. The man was juggling fire, literal fire, while a small crowd clapped in amazement, recording the moment on their phones. The flames licked the air, wild and alive, and he couldn't help but chuckle. "You spend your days taming light," he whispered, "and your nights paying to see it misbehave." Humans were strange like that. They craved control until they missed chaos. Maybe that's why cities never truly slept. Rest felt too much like surrender. Further down, a young woman sat on the sidewalk, sketching. Her fingers were smudged with charcoal, her hair tangled with focus. He leaned closer, watching the way her hand moved, careful, defiant, alive. On the paper, the world looked quieter, kinder. Art, he realized, had always been humanity's most polite way of arguing with reality. You draw, he thought, because you're not ready to forgive what exists. But even in rebellion, there was beauty. The sketch wasn't perfect, and that's what made it real. A bus roared past, splashing a puddle that shimmered under the lamplight. The city's veins were still moving, buses, cars, thoughts, all rushing somewhere uncertain. He wondered what everyone was chasing. Maybe comfort, maybe distraction, maybe each other. You call it progress, he thought, but it looks an awful lot like panic. Yet he couldn't deny the brilliance of it. Humanity had somehow managed to turn anxiety into architecture. If chaos had an art form, it would look like a rush hour skyline. He crossed a plaza where an old clock tower loomed over digital billboards. The hands of the clock moved slower than the screens below it, as if trying to remind the world of something it had forgotten. He stared for a while, amused. "You invented timepieces to measure patience," he murmured, then lost both. The irony of technology was that it gave humans everything except peace. They could capture seconds, but not silence. Still, he admired the attempt. People had never been good at accepting limits. That's why they'd made it this far. As he turned a corner, he found a man sitting on the curb, strumming a guitar softly. His case lay open, a few coins glinting like small stars. The melody was simple, haunting, honest. People passed without listening, but he did. The song wasn't about fame or love. It was about being seen, if only for a heartbeat. He understood that feeling. You don't sing for applause, he thought. You sing so the world remembers you existed. He dropped a coin in the case, though the man never saw it fall. Some gestures were meant for the universe, not for gratitude. Rain began to whisper, light at first, then steadier. The crowd scattered under umbrellas, but he kept walking. He liked the rain. It blurred everything. Lights, noise, faces, until the world looked honest again. Drops rolled down glass and metal, washing away the day's disguises. He passed a couple huddled together under a single umbrella, laughing as the wind tried to steal it. There it was again, that stubborn human defiance. To find joy even in inconvenience. "You've been drowning for centuries," he thought, and still managed to flirt in the rain. The downpour softened into drizzle as he reached the river. The water reflected the city like a trembling mirror. Every light on the surface looked alive, as if the stars had fallen and decided to stay. He stood there, watching the way their reflection rippled whenever the current shifted. Life was like that. Beautiful precisely because it refused to hold still. Perfection, he thought, is just motion pretending to be balance. He laughed quietly at the thought. Maybe that was why people kept breaking things. To give themselves something to fix, a reason to keep moving. He lingered there until the last of the rain faded, the air now thick with the scent of wet stone and possibility. Somewhere nearby, a clock struck 9. The sound rolled through the night like a memory that didn't know it was repeating itself. He listened, and for a fleeting second everything, the laughter, the rain, the hum of the city, seemed to sink into one perfect note. It didn't last, but then again, nothing beautiful ever did. That was the point. He smiled, his reflection melting into the water, his presence fading back into the rhythm he'd been following for centuries. The city didn't need him anymore, but it still called to him. Not for protection, but for witness. To see, to understand, to remember that even in all its absurdity, humanity still glowed. And as the night fully claimed the sky, he whispered it once more, his voice soft but certain. The same benediction he had carried through every age of light and shadow. All's well. He always liked how the night knew when to whisper and when to listen. It wasn't silence exactly, more like the city holding its breath. The streets were slick with yesterday's rain, each puddle a small universe reflecting fragments of the world above. He walked through them carefully, not because he feared slipping, but because stepping on reflections felt rude. You used to stare at stars for answers, he thought. Now you drop them in the gutter. The thought made him smile. Progress had its sense of irony. He stopped near a small cafe that hadn't yet closed, the kind of place that existed purely out of stubbornness. Inside, an old man sat by the window reading a newspaper, even though the world had moved past ink and patience. That sight warmed him, not because it was nostalgic, but because it proved resistance wasn't extinct. The barista leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone. while a radio in the corner hummed a forgotten song. Everything about the scene was beautifully unnecessary, which, he realized, was what made it sacred. Efficiency may feed the body, he thought, but inefficiency feeds the soul. Outside again, a delivery drone zipped overhead, blinking like an impatient firefly. He laughed quietly. The future had arrived, but somehow it still looked clumsy. "You've built flying machines?" he said to no one, "but they still deliver coffee and regret." It wasn't mockery, just amusement at how technology never outgrew human pettiness. Every invention started as a dream and ended up as a subscription. That was the rhythm of progress. Grand intentions, practical disappointments, yet he admired it. Hope, after all, was just failure with good posture. He turned a corner and found a small group of teenagers sitting on the curb, sharing a speaker and a bag of chips, their laughter ricocheting off the brick walls. The song they played was loud and terrible, which made it perfect. He couldn't understand the lyrics, but he understood the language. Defiance disguised as rhythm. He remembered the same energy from centuries ago, when young apprentices snuck ale from the taverns and sang off-key under the moon. Every generation thinks they invented rebellion, he thought, but the melody hasn't changed. Maybe that was the secret of survival. Keep dancing badly and pretending it matters. The night deepened as he walked through an underpass lit by flickering lights. Graffiti covered every inch of the walls. Names, symbols, questions. Some of it crude, some of it poetic. He stopped at one that read, "We are all temporary." The words hit him harder than he expected. "True," he murmured, "but some of you are impressively stubborn about it." He traced the letters with his hand, feeling the uneven texture of spray paint. It was strange. People used to carve prayers into stone, now they sprayed them on concrete. Different tools, same ache. Humanity never stopped negotiating with mortality, it just kept changing fonts. Emerging on the other side, he found himself by a row of apartment buildings, each window glowing with a different color of loneliness. Through one, he saw a woman watering a plant while talking to herself. Through another, a man staring blankly at a screen filled with faces. Everyone connected. Everyone isolated. It was almost elegant in its paradox. You built networks to stay close, he thought, and then used them to hide. Still, he couldn't blame them. Connection was messy, and people had always been afraid of the fingerprints that came with touch. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. Well, that ancient cry that once meant danger, but now simply meant routine. The city's heart still beat in emergencies. He stopped to watch as an ambulance sped past, lights slicing through the dark like an impatient angel. Inside, someone was probably fighting for one more breath, one more heartbeat, one more minute. "You've cured diseases," he whispered, "but not fear." It wasn't cynicism. It was awe. Humanity's refusal to stop trying was the most beautiful kind of madness. He passed a park where a streetlight buzzed like a tired bee. Beneath it, an elderly couple sat side by side on a bench, hands intertwined. They weren't talking, just sharing space. The kind of silence that took years to perfect. He felt something tighten in his chest. Love, he thought, was the only invention that never required an upgrade. It survived plagues, wars, Wi-Fi, and still managed to confuse everyone equally. If immortality had a scent, he thought, it would probably smell like rain and old affection. The sky above was losing its blackness, bleeding into early gray. He noticed how the city began to stretch awake again, how the rhythm shifted from memory to motion. A woman jogged past him, breath visible in the cold, determination painted on her face. "You run to escape," he thought, "but you always end up circling back to yourself." Still, he admired her for trying. Every generation had its rituals of repetition, prayers, pilgrimages, now cardio. A bus stopped nearby, its doors hissing open like a sigh. A handful of commuters climbed aboard, faces still half asleep. He watched them go and wondered what each carried inside. Hopes, worries, grocery lists, unspoken apologies. The modern world hid its struggles well. Instead of screams, people now whispered through stress and posture. He'd seen soldiers crumble and kings weep, but this quiet exhaustion, was new. The kind that came from fighting invisible battles against time, against meaning, against Monday. As he walked, the light grew stronger. The first sun rays spilled over the rooftops, turning metal into gold and mistakes into forgiveness. The city glowed, imperfect, alive, magnificent. He felt that old pull again, with that mix of melancholy and admiration. Humanity was ridiculous, fragile, hopeful beyond reason, and yet it kept trying. That was its greatest miracle. He paused at a corner where a child stood holding her mother's hand, blinking up at the sunlight as if seeing it for the first time. He smiled at that, realizing that maybe she was. Every day was someone's first sunrise, and maybe that was why the world kept spinning, because someone, somewhere, was always seeing it new. The morning swallowed the night's secrets, the noise rose again, and the watchman, eternal, amused, and strangely content, took one last look before fading into the brightness. He didn't need to say it anymore, but habit made him whisper it anyway, the words melting into the hum of the waking world like a quiet promise. All's well. The world was always loudest right before it pretended to wake up. The hum of traffic returned, impatient engines growling like they had somewhere holy to be. Coffee machines hissed in 1,000 kitchens, a ritual as sacred as any prayer. He stood at the corner watching it all, the synchronized chaos of civilization booting up again. People didn't rise with the sun anymore. They rose with alarms. You traded roosters for anxiety, he thought. At least the roosters didn't snooze. He wandered down the sidewalk, weaving through the choreography of the modern morning. Delivery bikes dodging pedestrians, phones glowing in trembling hands, dogs walking their distracted owners. The city was a living organism, but one that hadn't slept well in years. It buzzed with caffeine, deadlines, and denial. He smiled at the irony. Humanity had conquered darkness, but not drowsiness. You discovered electricity, he thought, and then used it to work later. A vendor opened his food cart, steam curling into the cold air. The smell of grilled bread and melted butter clung to the breeze, a scent older than language, reminding everyone that survival started with warmth and something to eat. He stopped for a moment, watching people queue up, wallets ready, faces blank. Every age had its form of communion, and this was theirs. Paper cups and small talk before the storm. He found it oddly poetic. The first hour of the day was always the same, no matter the century, a fragile attempt at optimism disguised as routine. The traffic light flickered from red to green, and the wave of motion resumed. People pouring across the street, heads down, earbuds in, lives rehearsed to the rhythm of habit. It was beautiful and absurd at once. You call it progress, he mused, but it looks a lot like choreography without music. Still, he couldn't deny there was grace in it. The invisible coordination of millions just trying to get somewhere that mattered. Every footstep was a story in motion, even if no one was listening. He turned into a smaller street, quieter, lined with shop fronts that still wore the dignity of imperfection. Chipped paint, crooked signs, windows cluttered with things no one truly needed. He loved that about the world, how it refused to be consistent. Every time people tried to make it efficient, it found new ways to trip over itself. You can automate work, he thought, but not wonder. A cat sat in one of the windows, blinking with the authority of something that owned the block. He nodded to it, because some traditions, like respecting cats, never expired. Passing a bookstore, he caught sight of a handwritten sign taped to the glass. Closed for renovations. Back soon, we hope. He laughed. The parenthesis was what made it honest. Humanity had always hidden its existential crises inside small disclaimers. We hope, he repeated softly, savoring the words. Hope was still the most ridiculous and courageous thing people did. Despite everything, they kept expecting the world to cooperate. That, he decided, was the true engine of civilization. Not fire, not language, but unreasonable optimism. A bus splashed through a puddle beside him, drenching his shoes. He looked down, sighed, then laughed. Some things never change, he muttered. In his time, it had been horse carts. Now it was engines, but the outcome was identical. Someone always ended up wet and annoyed. Maybe progress was just an elaborate loop. He wondered if humanity ever realized it was playing hide-and-seek with its own mistakes. Yet there was charm in that circularity, like watching children build and rebuild sandcastles just to feel the joy of beginning again. He wandered toward the river, where morning light hit the surface like liquid silver. Joggers moved along the path, their faces locked between focus and exhaustion. They ran not from danger, but from the quiet, as if stillness itself might catch up and ask uncomfortable questions. And he envied their conviction. You invented gyms, he thought, because you miss running for your life. He grinned at the absurd truth of it. Modern life was safe, yet everyone seemed more tired than ever. Maybe danger had been replaced by deadlines and the body never got the memo. A woman nearby stopped to photograph the sunrise, tilting her phone, framing the shot, adjusting filters that made nature look more like memory. He found himself amused. You used to paint sunsets to immortalize them, he thought. Now you just upload proof you were present. But he didn't judge her. Every age had its tools for saying I was here. The need to be witnessed was eternal. Even he, the unseen observer, was guilty of that longing, the desire to leave behind something that meant more than footsteps. As the sun climbed higher, the shadows shrank, and the world lost its tenderness. The morning rush became a full-throttle day. Horns, voices, urgency. He slipped through it unnoticed, feeling both connected and irrelevant. That was the strange magic of existing too long. You learned that history was just repetition with better branding. But beneath the surface noise, he could still sense something fragile and human pulsing through it all. The same pulse he had guarded for centuries, though now it guarded itself. He stopped at a crosswalk where a small boy was tugging at his mother's hand, pointing up at the sky. The boy's eyes were wide with wonder, but the mother didn't look up. She was answering an email. He followed the boy's gaze. A flock of birds spiraled above the buildings, weaving invisible patterns through the morning air. It was breathtaking, the kind of beauty that existed only for those who bothered to notice. You'll learn to look down soon, he thought sadly. But for now, keep looking up. A bus rumbled by, carrying faces pressed against the glass, commuters staring out as if the world outside were happening to someone else. He wondered if they realized they were the world. Most people didn't. They mistook participation for observation. The truth was simpler. Everyone was both actor and audience, performer and spectator. Life wasn't a stage. It was a crowded street where everyone kept bumping into meaning and pretending it was coincidence. The air began to warm, the rhythm of the day settling into predictable patterns. Yet, somewhere in that predictability, he found comfort. The city, for all its contradictions and exhaustion, still moved. People still woke up, still tried, still cared. Clumsily, blindly, beautifully. That was the miracle no one ever noticed. Not that humanity survived, but that it kept deciding to. He looked once more at the skyline, the glass towers catching sunlight like promises, too bright to keep. And for a moment he felt something that wasn't nostalgia or duty, but admiration. Against all odds, the species still had the audacity to hope. He smiled, that same patient, knowing smile that had outlived empires and electric storms, and let the morning light wrap around him like memory. Then, in a voice meant not for the city, but for time itself, he spoke the only truth that had never changed, the quiet refrain that ended every vigil, every age, every watch. All's well. He always said that mornings had terrible timing. They arrived too soon for those who still had something to dream, and too late for those who were already running. The city was awake again, but it wasn't the graceful kind of awakening. It was the messy kind, full of noise, impatience, and caffeine-fueled determination. He stood quietly by a crosswalk, watching people rush toward invisible deadlines, their steps synchronized with anxiety. You mastered fire, he thought, but you still can't handle mornings. He walked along the boulevard, where shopkeepers were unlocking doors and delivery trucks coughed exhaust into the air. The world was in motion again, pretending that momentum was progress. The hum of conversation rose from every corner. People negotiating, complaining, flirting, surviving. It was comforting in a strange way, that endless repetition of humanity trying again. You'd think, he mused, after centuries of trial and error you'd learn to relax. But no, relaxation had become a scheduled event. He chuckled at the thought that even peace now required a calendar reminder. A coffee shop caught his attention. Inside, the air buzzed with productivity. Laptops open, faces glowing blue in digital devotion. Everyone was multitasking like their souls depended on it. He watched a man type furiously while scrolling through his phone and sipping coffee at the same time. That's not focus, he thought. That's performance art. But he admired the effort. Humanity had turned chaos into choreography. Every gesture, every sigh, every glance at the clock was part of a grand ballet called survival. At the corner table, a young woman stared out the window, lost in thought, stirring her drink long after the sugar had dissolved. He knew that look, the quiet stare of someone realizing that dreams and responsibilities had the same face now. The world taught ambition but never explained what to do when it arrived empty-handed. He wanted to tell her that confusion was not failure, it was just consciousness stretching, but the moment passed. She put on her headphones and disappeared into her own soundtrack. Back outside, the sunlight had grown sharp, slicing through the skyscrapers in geometric precision. He paused to admire the way light behaved, always finding cracks to slip through, always proving that even glass and steel couldn't imprison it completely. You try to control everything, he thought, but light still refuses to follow your rules. That amused him deeply, how people built barriers to protect themselves, only to spend their lives longing for what leaked through. He wandered past a park where children were playing, their laughter bouncing off concrete like bright, stubborn echoes. Parents hovered with smartphones, filming joy instead of participating in it. He couldn't help but grin. You invented magic, he thought, then got too busy documenting it. Still, he couldn't fault them. The urge to preserve was deeply human, to capture what slips away, even if it means not fully living it. He'd spent lifetimes watching people try to outsmart impermanence, and yet it was their losing battle that made them so beautiful. An old man sat on a bench tossing crumbs to pigeons, the unofficial philosophers of every city. The birds strutted with smug entitlement, pecking at the offerings as if accepting tribute. He watched them for a while, smiling softly. You think you've domesticated the world, he thought, but a pigeon still decides who owns the square. The man threw another handful of crumbs, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. No schedules, no ambition, just coexistence between two species that never truly understood each other but kept showing up anyway. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of street food and exhaust, of new perfume and old rain. That blend, life and decay sharing the same breath, reminded him why he loved cities. They were contradictions with plumbing. Everywhere he looked, the world was simultaneously collapsing and rebuilding. A construction crane loomed over a half-finished building, a perfect metaphor for existence itself. You're always under renovation, he thought, and somehow that's what keeps you standing. He found himself by the river again, where the water flowed lazily beneath a bridge covered in graffiti. Words of love, anger, poetry, nonsense, all claiming a slice of eternity on concrete. One caught his eye. We were here. He ran his hand across it gently. 3 words. Infinite longing. Humans had been writing the same sentence for thousands of years. On cave walls, parchment, social media. You fear being forgotten, he thought, so you never stop announcing yourself. And yet, it worked. They were still remembered, all of them, in the ripples of the stories they left behind. A street musician played near the bridge, his case half full of coins, his voice half broken with sincerity. People passed without really listening, but he didn't mind. The music wasn't for them. It was for the air. It was an act of defiance, a small rebellion against silence. The watchman stopped to listen, feeling something tighten in his chest. There it was again, that human need to turn pain into melody, confusion into rhythm. You're terrible at peace, he thought, but brilliant at meaning. As the afternoon aged, the city's tempo changed. The hurried footsteps slowed, the sunlight softened, and conversations began to sound less like transactions and more like stories. He loved this hour, when ambition tired itself out and honesty began to slip through. A couple sat by the river, speaking softly, their hands brushing like hesitant confessions. He didn't need to hear the words to understand them. The language of vulnerability hadn't evolved much since his time. It was still the same trembling syntax of hope. Shadows began to stretch across the pavement, long and deliberate. The day was bowing out, gracefully or perhaps out of exhaustion. He followed its rhythm, moving through the fading light like an echo trying to stay relevant. There was comfort in endings, he realized. The world obsessed over beginnings, but it was the act of finishing that made life profound. You fear the end, he thought, but it's the only reason you start anything. He reached a hill overlooking the skyline where the sun was now sinking behind glass towers that glowed like embers. The wind brushed against him gently, and for a moment, everything, the noise, the movement, the centuries, seemed to slow into perfect stillness. Cities had grown louder, people faster, lives shorter, but the essence remained unchanged, a collective, chaotic effort to keep meaning alive. He smiled, amused by his own sentimentality. You think you've outgrown magic, he whispered, but you still chase light across the sky every evening. He let that thought linger, soft and warm, as the last of the sun disappeared and the first streetlights flickered awake, the city's heartbeat resetting for another endless night. And when the darkness finally reclaimed its place, he exhaled a small, knowing laugh, the kind that belongs to someone who's seen too much and still believes it's worth seeing again. Then, like every night before and everyone yet to come, he said the only thing that ever truly needed saying. All's well. The night, he thought, had a peculiar way of softening everything, even truth. It draped over the city like a confession whispered too late, turning sharp edges into secrets and noise into memory. The air was cooler now, perfumed with rain and exhaust, the twin fragrances of progress and decay. He walked without hurry, listening to the hum of streetlights, that quiet electric chorus that had replaced the crickets of his youth. You call this silence, he thought, but it's just civilization humming to itself. He stopped near a window display where mannequins stood frozen mid-pose, dressed for lives no one really lived. Their stillness mocked the rush outside. It fascinated him. How humans built replicas of themselves, just to sell better versions of who they already were. You used to worship statues, he mused. Now they're on sale. There was comedy in that, the way every generation reinvented vanity and called it culture, yet he couldn't help but admire it. Even their illusions were industrious. Humanity, he decided, was nothing if not dedicated to pretending beautifully. A man hurried past, talking to someone unseen through his earpiece, gesturing wildly. From a distance, he looked like a prophet arguing with the wind. The watchman smiled. Once, people would have called that divine inspiration, he whispered. Now it's just customer service? It was hard not to be amused by how technology had transformed madness into multitasking. But beneath the laughter, there was something tender, the quiet tragedy of people desperate to be heard, even if only by machines. At a crosswalk, a woman dropped her bag, spilling its contents across the wet pavement. He watched as strangers rushed to help, hands gathering fallen coins, a notebook, a half-eaten apple. No one spoke much, but the gestures were gentle, automatic. There it was again, the thing that kept him walking century after century, the unplanned kindness that still managed to survive industrialization, algorithms, and bad moods. You've complicated everything, he thought, except compassion. That was the thread that never tore, no matter how much time pulled at it. He turned down a narrower street, where neon signs buzzed like nervous thoughts, and the smell of food drifted through half-open doors. A man stood outside a late-night diner flipping a sign from open to closed, though a couple of customers lingered inside, reluctant to return to whatever waited beyond. He understood that reluctance. The diner was one of those rare places where time hesitated, where people talked to strangers without irony, where coffee tasted like company. You don't need temples, he thought. You already built them. They just serve pancakes now. He walked on past graffiti that read, "Tomorrow is overrated." He laughed out loud at that one. You're right, he said to the wall. but try convincing the rent collector. There was something deeply poetic about how the city's cynicism was sprayed in colors so bright. Even despair had to be eye-catching now. He remembered when hopelessness was quiet. Now it needed followers. And yet there was honesty in those painted words. People had grown weary of promises dressed as futures. They preferred the honesty of exhaustion. At a bus stop, an older man sat alone, tapping his cane in rhythm to music only he could hear. The watchman watched him for a while, imagining the tune. Maybe a song from a dance long forgotten, maybe something new. The man's face was calm, almost content, and in that moment he looked like someone who had finally stopped chasing everything he couldn't name. It struck him, how peace always looked unremarkable from the outside. You confuse stillness with defeat, he thought, but it's just wisdom sitting down to rest. The sky above the city was hazy, painted with light pollution, a kind of artificial dusk that never ended. He tilted his head up, trying to find a star, just one, but even the constellations seemed to have clocked out. It made him laugh quietly. You reached the moon, he thought, and somehow made the stars disappear. The irony was rich. Humanity's victories always came with scenic casualties. Yet he couldn't stay cynical. The same hands that blocked the stars had also built poetry about missing them. That balance was the human signature. Destruction paired with self-awareness. A gust of wind tugged at his coat, and he turned toward the river again. The water shimmered with reflections. Skyscrapers bending like ghosts, streetlights dripping gold into the current. He leaned against the railing, thinking of how many times he had stood like this, in different cities, by different rivers, watching civilization reinvent its reflection. You always think you're new, he murmured, but you're just the same story in different shoes. Still, he admired the effort. Reinvention was humanity's way of apologizing to itself. Somewhere behind him, a distant siren wailed, steady, familiar, not quite tragic. It reminded him of Monk's chants, oddly enough. The city's liturgy had simply traded bells for alarms. He listened to it fade, blending into the sound of tires on wet asphalt, the occasional laughter spilling from an open bar door, the symphony of survival, messy but sincere. Every note told the same truth. The world, for all its confusion, still wanted to live. He began to walk again, slower this time. The air had cooled, and somewhere a bakery had started preparing for the next day. The scent of fresh dough drifted across the street, absurdly hopeful for an hour so late. That was what he loved about humanity. The insistence on baking at dawn after falling apart at dusk. You fall, you rise, you bake, he said, shaking his head with a grin. You've made endurance smell like bread. Passing a bench, he saw a homeless man asleep beneath a blanket of newspapers. The headlines screamed crisis, politics, outrage, but underneath them, a man dreamed. That image stopped him for a moment. The fragile poetry of a world that slept on its own noise. You cover yourselves in chaos, he thought, but somehow still find rest. It was humbling, really. Maybe the human spirit wasn't resilient because of strength, but because of selective hearing. The city had grown quieter now, its noise condensed into whispers and footsteps. He knew this hour well, the brief peace between exhaustion and rebirth. Street sweepers hummed by, washing away the evidence of life's excesses. Soon the lights would change again, the streets would fill, and the cycle would begin anew. And yet, in that pause, the world felt almost wise, almost ancient again. He took one last look at the skyline, the glittering illusion of permanence. It never failed to move him. Everything was temporary, yet everyone built as if it would last forever. Maybe that was the real miracle. Not immortality, but the refusal to stop pretending it was possible. He found comfort in that contradiction. It was what made life bearable, the endless human habit of caring too much about things that would fade anyway. The horizon lightened faintly, a whisper of dawn teasing the edges of night. He felt it, that shift in the air, that soft tremor of beginning. Somewhere, a bird dared to sing before the rest of the city remembered how. He smiled, amused, knowing that the day would soon roar again. But for now, the world was caught in its most honest state, half asleep, half alive, beautiful in its confusion. He closed his eyes, letting the hum of existence settle around him one last time. There were no prayers to say, no lessons left to learn, just this, the certainty that chaos and grace were never enemies, only partners. The city exhaled. So did he. And then, with a voice both ancient and amused, he whispered the only sentence that still made sense after all these centuries, the one that had outlasted kings, wars, gods, and even meaning itself. All's well.